Well, good morning, everybody. I hope the Porto night was not too tough for you. We are going to start with our plenary session this morning, and one of the appeals, of the many appeals of coming to the annual Eaap conferences is that they are organized every year in a different place, a different city, a different country, all over Europe. And we have the opportunity to get to know a bit about the local agriculture, the livestock sector, and for us, animal science, also to get some insight on the main research lines carried out by the local researchers. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear more about this, to hear a bit more about this from Nuno Canada, who will present us the animal science ecosystem in Portugal. Dr. Canada is the current president of the Eaap, the Portuguese National Institute for Agriculture and Veterinary Research, and he holds a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Lisbon and a PhD from the University of Porto. He completed his training with postgraduate courses in general management, public management, and international business, and he is also associate professor at the Abel Salazar Institute of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Porto and has been so since 1999. Among his many institutional responsibilities, he is a member of the board of directors of the International Center for Advanced Mediterranean Agronomic Studies, the CIEAM, in Paris, and since 2013, he has been the chairman of the board of directors of the Eaap, the Portuguese National Institute for Agriculture and Veterinary Research. So, Nuno, please, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Good morning. So I will present you the animal science ecosystem that we have in Portugal. I will begin by the main challenges for we are working with our research programs in Portugal. The challenges is common for the other countries, and the first one is the food security and food safety. We are working for produce each time more food, to be more efficient, but to achieve also high patterns of food safety. The second challenge about we working for is the emerging diseases. We are working in 4 main areas. The first one is the zoonoses. As you know, today, more than 60% of the emergent diseases of the humans come from the animals. So zoonosis is a main area of research to us. The second area regarding the animal health is the diseases with high economic impact, food animal diseases with high economic impact. The third area of work is the diseases that may act as barriers of exportation. Portugal, in the area of food, animal production, and animal origin products, are exporting a lot, and the markets for exportation are very important to us. So all the diseases that can act as barriers for exportation is an important field of work to us. And the fourth area of work is the diseases that may be important to the wildlife. So we are working in a integrated approach, in a One Health approach in that area of animal diseases. The other important area to us is the climate change. As you know, Portugal is one of the countries of Europe more affected by the climate change, and this is a main area of activity to us. The fourth area is the scarcity of natural resources, water, soil, and energy. Energy in Portugal is very expensive, so we are working a lot in new approaches to the transition to clean energies in order to for environmental reasons, but also for economical reasons. Other important area to us is the quality, the differentiation of our products. Portugal is a small country, and we need to add value to our products. So we have a lot of research lines in order to add value to our animal origin products. And the efficiency. The way to face that economical problems that we have today is by that two main areas of activity: improving the efficiency and add value to the products that we sell. So another important area is the circular economy. We are moved to the linear agriculture to the circular agriculture, and we are doing a lot of work in that area. And regarding the digitalization and the mechanization, we are working to in the area of robotics, mechanization, digitalization, to face the problem of lack of availability of human resources in all the agricultural areas, but in particular in animal production. So more recently, we have new threats. You are having the COVID-19, the problem with energy, transport, and raw material costs. This year in particular, we have been a huge problem with drought in Portugal, and of course the Ukrainian war. All the problems taken together have been increasing the costs of the factor costs of production, has decreased a lot the profit margins of the farmers, have increased the food price for the consumer, increased a lot the uncertainty. The sustainability of the companies and families are in risk, and of course we are facing a huge social impact. So we believe that only with more science, more knowledge, and more innovation, we are able to face that challenges about I talked. But the knowledge and the technology that we have today in the field, in the farms, are not enough to face that challenges that we have. So we need to act in two main areas. One of that is provide more solutions to farmers, to technicians, to face that challenges. But the other very important area is to prepare the farmers and the technicians to adopt the new solutions. Now we are providing a lot of new solutions in Europe, but the farmers and the technicians that support, that give the technical support to the farmers, are not yet prepared to adopt that solution. So there are a lot of work that we need to do in training. I'm talking about upskilling, reskilling, in order to prepare the farmers and the technicians to adopt the solutions of digitalization, the new solutions on the bioeconomy sector, and we need to look at some time to both sides of the problem, the provide the solutions and the adopt the solution. So in Portugal, as I told you today, we designed a strategic agenda to this decade, until 2030, and the objective is to do a transition to circular and climate-neutral agriculture, transition to more sustainable agricultural systems, transition to circular agriculture, a transition to agriculture 4.0. This strategic agenda that was adopted by the government, and now it is a key document for all that we are doing in agriculture and food in Portugal, has 4 main goals: more health, and with the objective to increase in 20% the adherence of the adhesion of the Mediterranean diet; more inclusion, and the objective is to increase 20%, it's a mistake, it's to increase in 80% the new young farmers that are working in low-density territories. There is a mistake here. More income, to increase 15% the value of agri-food production. More future, more than 50% of the agricultural area in recognized sustainable production regimes. And very important, to increase in 60% the investment in research and development in that area of agriculture and food, including animal science. The agenda is not only oriented to farmers, it is an agenda oriented to the society. The targets of this agenda is citizens, territory, producers, and agents of public policies. And for each target, we designed the emblematic initiatives, that is the main objectives, the main areas of actuation of that agenda. For example, in the target of the society, there are 2 main areas of activity. One of them is sustainable food systems, and another one is One Health initiative. And inside of each of those main areas, there are a lot of research lines. In the territory, for example, we have the area of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, the circular agriculture. In the value chain, we have the agriculture, smart agriculture, energetic transition, the promotion of the national products, and in the governance, in the public sector, we have some emblematic initiatives. And I would like to stress the innovation network. Regarding the research and innovation, this initiative is one of the most important. The innovation network, it's an initiative financing by the resilience plan that will put 24 research and innovation centers working as a network. Each of one of that research centers are thematic, but will work in network with the other centers, and the emblematic initiatives are transversal to all of the centers, to all of the countries. In Eaap, the National Institute for Agronomic and Veterinary Research is the head of that innovation network, and this institute works in the interface between the scientific system and the farmers, the industry, and other agents from the territory. Regarding the animal science, we have 4 main centers in that innovation network. One of that is in the north, near here, 20 kilometers from Porto, that has the national reference labs of food safety, as also labs of animal health, and develops a lot of activity with food industry. Another center is in Oeiras, near Lisbon, that has the national reference labs of animal health and research activity in the development of vaccines for animals, including wildlife, and there's also the reference labs for feed safety. In the south, we have a center oriented to improve to genetic improvement of plants that works with new varieties with pastures and forages, and also with new varieties with other kind of plants, very oriented to the adaptation of climate change. And in the near Sanitary, we have the main center of animal science research. Some of you will visit the center next Friday. We have with us the director of the center, Olga Moreira. And this is in the innovation network, the main center of research in animal science. Is very oriented to provide new solutions to farmers, to different breeds of livestock, and also to feed and food industry. The main areas of activity of this center is the reproduction, breeding, and genetics. This center has the National Portuguese Germplasm Bank, and also a lot of activity in animal reproduction of all species. Another main area of activity is animal production. We have facilities to develop experimentation in the different species, and animal production is a core area of activity of this center. And more recently, we are developing activity in the mitigation of climate changes with ruminants, of course, and in the circular agriculture. This center are working a lot with feed industry. I will talk about that kind of collaborative structure, feeding of, and also with that new area of activity of insects. The National Association of companies that develop solutions insect-based are based in that center, and this center have a lot of activity in that area. And of course the interface and the work with the food industry. Another important area of the ecosystem is the network of laboratories that we have in that innovation network. I would like to stress the national reference laboratories that are based on that innovation network, in particular the animal health laboratory, but also the feed and food safety laboratories. Those laboratories are very important to support the research lines in order to develop tools for early diagnosis of diseases from animals, but also from plants, and to develop tools to facilitate the control and the eradication of the diseases of animals, including zoonoses, where we work closely with the National Institutes of Health. So now I would like to talk a little bit about some collaborative organizations that we have in our ecosystem. Part of them are similar to the organizations that exist in other countries, but there are some models that are innovative. So we have basically three main collaborative types of organizations that are complementary. One of that is collaborative laboratories. Collaborative laboratories are structures that are work with industry, closely with industry, where the scientific system work in closely cooperation with industry in order to provide new solutions to the industry. It is the collaborative laboratories. Competence centers, it's a different organizations. It is a collaborative organization where the scientific system works closely with the farmers and with the farmers' organizations in order to increase the transfer of knowledge and technology to the farmers and to the farmers' organization. And we have the associate laboratories also, that is a centers where a collaborative organization where different research centers work together in the field of research, since basic research, fundamental research to applied research in different areas. In the area of the animal science, we have a new center for animals. So we have three different kind of organizations that act complementary between them. One of them more in the innovation side with industry, another more in the research side, and the third one more working in the transfer of knowledge and technology to the farmers. I will give you some examples. The collaborative laboratories, that is the structures that works on innovation with industry, related to that area of animal science, we have 4 labs working in that area. One of them is Smart Farm Collab. It is a collaborative laboratory that are working in order to provide digital solutions to agriculture and food, including in the livestock production. The other one is Collab for Food, that works with the food industry, including the animal products origin food industry. The Innov Plant Protect are working for provide biological-based solutions to the agriculture and food. And Feedinov is the more important collaborative laboratory in that area of animal science. Feedinov is based in the research center that I told you before in Sanitary, in the innovation pole of Fonte Boa, and is the leadership of that collab is made by Eaap. Eaap is the Portuguese Association of Feed Industry, and the leadership is made by Eaap. Usually the leadership of the collaborative laboratories are made also always by the industry, not by the research side. And there are the partners of the scientific system, Eaap and other companies related to feed and animal production. So the key competencies of that collaborative laboratory are those key competencies. And the target is scientific, technological, and innovation consultancy and assistant, and transfer knowledge and technology to the industry. That kind of collaborative organizations are also very important to hire and to capacitate highly qualified human resources to work in the innovation in that field of knowledge, in the area of animal production, with feed industry and other companies, because it is a kind of organization that have the scientific system with all the critical mass and the knowledge of scientific system, working very close to the private companies, and it is an ecosystem very adequate to the education, including advanced education of people to work in industry. The action plan of that collaborative laboratory has these 7 main areas of activity: consumption and animal products, resource efficiency, quality and product safety, green feed for circular economy, new process, animal feed and livestock production 4.0, and knowledge and transfer dissemination. So regarding the other collaborative organization competence centers, that is the kind of organizations where the scientific system works closely with farmers and with farmers' organization in order to increase the transfer of knowledge and technology to the farmers. We have in Portugal 24 competence centers in different areas of agriculture and food. In the areas more related to animal science, those 4 are the more important. And I will give you the example of Eaap Tech Agro. This competence center will be with you in next Friday. You will have a visit to the Innovation Center of Fonte Boa, and that competence center will be with you in that visit. So it is a center oriented to technological innovation in the agroforestry sector, in the areas of agriculture, food, forestry, and animal production. And the vision is accelerate the farmers' transition to new technologies approaches. It is a center that have 65 partners around the country, that has all the main farmers' associations of the countries, that has also all the scientific partners that works in that area of digitalization of agriculture, and has also some agents from the territory, like municipalities or organizations for local development. The main areas of activity of that competence center is that areas: artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, interoperability, robotics, virtual and augmented reality, Internet of Things, data science and big data, simulation, blockchain, cloud computing, and connectivity. Regarding the livestock precision farming, the competence center are working mainly in that areas at the moment. Robotic milkers, automatic feeders, activity collars, inline milk sensors, electronic identification and smart tags, automated weight detection cameras, microphones to detect respiratory problems, antibiotic resistance surveillance system. That area of resistance, antibiotic resistance, is very important today, as you know, and the projects are developed closely with the national reference labs. The third collaborative area that we have in our ecosystem is the Associate Laboratory for Animal and Veterinary Science, all for animals. These laboratories are made of 3 main research centers, SECA, CISA and SECAV, and have as key partners the National Institute for Agrarian and Veterinary Research, the National Institute of Health that are working with us in the zoonosis and in other issues that may affect human health, and the National Authority for Animal Health and Feed and Food Safety. As I told you, this lab works more in the research side, not so much in the innovation, since fundamental research until applied research. This lab has 3 main thematic lines: green animal production, emergent infectious diseases, including zoonosis, and comparative and translational medicine and biotechnology, and are working for 5 main challenges inside that thematic lines, that it is increasing the sustainability of livestock production, safe and healthy animal source foods, management of animal genetic resources, innovation in diagnostic, therapeutics and vaccines for emergent infectious diseases, including zoonosis, and the development of innovative therapies and diagnostic tools through a comparative translational approach. So this is the 3 main collaborative areas that we have. So now the ecosystem and animal science that we have in Portugal as a whole, of course, that we have a lot of activity in the universities and the polytechnic institutes, in the high education system. We have the interface institutes, that the research and innovation institutes that works in the interface between the scientific system and the farmers and the industry, that are working with the universities and the polytechnics in order to transfer the knowledge and technology to the farmers and to the industry. Then we have that collaborative laboratories, associated laboratories, competence centers. Now, more recently, we have that innovation network, and all of that ecosystem are working in closely cooperation with farmers and industry, but also with the other territorial agents, like organization for local development, municipalities, and other agents. So this is the ecosystem of innovation and research that we are developing in Portugal for agriculture and food, including the animal science part. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Nuno, for this very interesting perspective on your agenda for agriculture, which is very much aligned. It couldn't be otherwise with the European strategies of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, and also for the very interesting presentation about the collaborative research and innovation network that you have here in Portugal. Some of our participants will be very lucky to know it themselves when they visit them in our study tours on Friday. Now we will move to the main topic of the plenary session today, which is the interactions between wildlife and livestock, and how can we make the coexistence possible. Interactions between livestock and wildlife are becoming more frequent, not only in Europe, but also globally. They are difficult to avoid, and they can often lead to conflicts. This is due, on the one hand, to the degradation and loss of natural habitat for wildlife due to urbanization and agriculture, with both humans and livestock encroaching their natural habitats. On the other hand, extensive farming and wildlife have traditionally shared some of these habitats. This is particularly relevant, although it's not exclusive, in the case of many pastoral systems located in remote areas, which can face serious problems due to predation by carnivores. The continuity of these systems in a sustainable, but obviously in an economically profitable way, is the key for preservation of landscapes and biodiversity in many high nature value areas throughout Europe. These interactions can negatively affect wildlife populations and lead to biodiversity loss, but they can also reduce livestock productivity due to factors such as predation, crop damage, or shared diseases between farmed animals and fauna. The spread of zoonotic diseases as a result of this interaction is also a concern for humans, as we have seen in the past couple of years. And this supports the need for a One Health approach for their prevention and control in order to minimize risks. For all these reasons, the coexistence of livestock and wildlife is a very delicate issue that raises social tensions. Farmers may see their livelihoods threatened as a consequence of their productivity loss, and now not only conservationists, but also the general public demand that adequate management plans are implemented in order to ensure this coexistence. It's therefore essential to identify innovative solutions to prevent and control the damage made by wild animals to agriculture and farming, and at the same time to protect wildlife. It's also of major importance to facilitate the dialogue between the different stakeholders dealing with these interactions, and also to take into consideration the many social, economic, cultural, and political aspects that are involved in this issue, which can be quite a challenge. To give us some insight into these aspects, today we will have 4 speakers dealing with the coexistence of livestock. First, we will have the 4 presentations that you can see on the slide. We will have a short coffee break at 10:30, I think, and we will have the fourth presentation afterwards and a general discussion. So please save your questions for this second part of the session. I am sure these speakers will give you food for thought. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Francesca Cagnacci. Francesca is a researcher at the Animal Ecology Group at Fondazione Edmund Mach in Trento, in Italy. She is a behavioral and conservation ecologist with research emphasis on ecological and evolutionary drivers of animal behavior, movement, and resource use. In particular, she looks into the effects of climate change and human disturbance on animals' spatial distribution and interactions. She coordinates the consortium Euromammals, and has co-founded the Global Initiative on Ungulate Migration, which is in partnership with the Convention for Migratory Species at the United Nations. Francesca is also interested in technology applied to conservation issues such as biologging or development of data standards. She has teamed up with the most prestigious university in Europe and America and has a large worldwide network of colleagues and institutions. So please, Francesca, thanks very much, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind words and for the invitation here. I'm very honored to participate into this conference because, as you will see, I'm very curious about cross research, and I have previously worked together with animal scientists. So I think we share more than what we think in terms of technology, interest, and questions. So again, I'm very happy today to present here. I will give a brief introduction about my field of research that hopefully will serve as the backbone of the presentation. I work, as have been presented by the chair, into wildlife behavior adaptations to environmental anthropogenic drivers. And I believe that this is important for us to scientifically address the challenges that the coexistence is presenting us. I put here some of the potential keywords that define my research, but one very important aspect that you will catch throughout my presentation is the fact that we have to constantly adopt, that's what I think is necessary, a global approach. So we can have an understanding of the general patterns thanks to large-scale studies, hopefully through collaborative networks, for example, Euromammals, that has been introduced before kindly by the chair. It's a collaborative initiative that puts together more than 180 research institutes, conservation areas, and management units across Europe, including veterinary units, to put together 100 and plus study areas so that when we study the effects of human disturbance or environmental change or ecological drivers or fauna, we do have an understanding that goes beyond the local aspect. And indeed, the next speaker is also part of this network, for example, so just to reiterate what I've just said. But then, if you want to understand the mechanisms that are underpinning the patterns that we are observing, it's then important to approach the questions with an empirical and potentially experimental attitude. And for this is necessary to have a more local and regional scale, which will also understand to penetrate those that are the actual drivers more specifically. And as you see from the map, I'm from Trentino, rather I work in Trentino, which is completely covered by mountains, and there is a lot of extensive farming, which is really part of the backbone of traditions there. This is the peak of the Brenta with me in front, and one may think that this is what we're dealing with, but that's not the whole story, because Trentino is also this. It's also a very busy alpine place because of touristic attractions, because of interchange nodes of transports, and therefore we do have a very classic study case to understand the processes and that are underpinning the large-scale patterns. Please allow me to give you a little bit of an outlook of those aspects, those topics that are very relevant to our research and that are connected one another in a theoretical scheme that is very much connected with the problems that we are facing this morning. We start our understanding from those aspects that are at a large scale, such as climate and land use, that influence habitat and food resources of wild animals. And this has a very tight interconnection with the so-called internal state, so their way to react individually, because after all, each individual reacts as we do as humans also differently one another, so they're not just a sum of units, but it's actually very nuanced individually. That indeed sums up individual movement behavior. Movement is the way by which animals actually interact with the space around themselves and therefore also the environment and also us and our activities. When we scale up from individuals to the distribution of several individuals into a defined context, we can speak about population, and therefore we obtain the population distribution. which is connected to the population demography via individual fitness, and therefore shaping the distribution of species and communities. We have to take into account, though, that this is not just what happens for the single species, but there are many species at the same time. And it's very important, it's probably key in this talk, to consider humans as part of those. So when we consider interspecific competition and the effect of that on the single species, the presence of humans enters into this kind of dialogue. So it's not necessarily superimposed, but it's really like another competitor. And it has direct consequences on individual fitness, together with predation, so top-down effects. And, of course, let's not forget host parasite pathogens, transmit and host parasite pathogens cycles that are really a driving force of ecosystem changes, but also ecosystem stability, as you know very well. Within this complex scheme, we can identify some areas of interest that are very important to interpret what we observe right now when we look into the interaction between wildlife and humans. Each species has a fundamental niche, as it's been defined in classic ecological theory, which means those abiotic conditions where they can survive. We do have a fundamental niche as well, and we are very concerned these days by our fundamental niche, as we are just coming out of a very hot and dry summer throughout Europe. And so we know very well our limit to have a decent livelihood, which are also different between individuals. But then the fundamental niche of each species is not as such placed in the void, but it's happening through and interacting through the presence of other species that have their fundamental niche, and therefore together they create that we call the realized niche. So those conditions where multiple species can coexist. And so pretty much the final aim of this topic is to try and single out some aspects that we need to understand to find the realized niche where wildlife species and human can coexist, which I will also leave to the next speakers. I will just give the premises to that. I just point out one important aspect for what concerns my research, and also that really underlines one of the really main spurring disciplines within ecology, which is the movement ecology paradigm. As I mentioned before, the fact that animals move in the environment allows them to interact with resources, interact with one another, interact with competitors, and it's only via considering the cycles between individuals passing by places and using the resources and back that we can understand all the different processes. Processes that include bottom-up effects. We call bottom-up effects those that are going from primary production up, that animal science has studied very thoroughly and very well. I wish we would have the same understanding. So how much the food intake, the trophic resources can shape the individual welfare, individual fitness, and also, in your case, production, in my case, demography and dynamics. But also, we have top-down effects that are becoming particularly important these days with the increasing presence of predators in Europe, but also always include, again, that driving force, which is everywhere and we don't see it, which is host parasite pathogen cycles. We can particularly identify another kind of process, which is the exploitative and behavioral competition between different species that include humans. So the fact that a competitor can directly affect individual fitness, for example, by taking away a habitat or by directly predating, but also, not predating, but interfering, or simply behaviorally affect the presence of the other species. Just a single note to say that everything is studied with a nuance and multiple technological techniques, multiple techniques and technological tools and approaches from the micro scale with microbiota analysis, genomics to metabarcoding, to the top scale with biologging, camera trapping, and so on. And I would really like to stress the fact that you may not know, but we are copying you a lot in wildlife biology, because the ultimate technology often comes from animal science. And I have recently, for example, installed, I think, one of the first automatic weighing device in the field to weigh roe deer, and normally it's used to weigh cows. So I think it's particularly interesting, this cross-exchange between technologies. And so we get to the topic of my talk, which is carving a path across local challenges. We want to analyze what are the wildlife responses to the European anthroscape in order to better lay out potential mitigation actions that would allow coexistence and a general welfare. We have two levels. We have global challenges where we consider human-driven effects that are coming from very large-scale processes, for example, climate change or land use change, habitat fragmentation, as has been mentioned very precisely and very nicely by the chair. And clearly for all these processes, I will just give some examples, and we could expand more and more, but I just have 23 minutes right now, and I want to stick to that. So don't think this is just what we can see, it's just a specific angle. And I will take the angle that for sure will take some interest in this audience, because it's been probably the new factor in animal science in the last decades in Europe, which is the increase of large predators. Just 3 years ago, we published, 2 years ago, we published this paper that for the first time tried to relate the trend in large carnivore increase in Europe with factors that are related to humans. And in particular, it was shown that that there is a very clear relation between the probability to find, this is the probability to find carnivores, large carnivores, and human population density. So essentially, the less we are there, the more it's probable to find large carnivores, and vice versa. So there is a very clear, very neat inverse relationship between human presence and human population density in particular, in this case, and presence of large carnivore. And it's funny to see that this is a super clear relationship, whereas the relation with the classic biodiversity index, indicated here by Shannon index, it's not so clear and so obvious. We would imagine that large carnivores are present in the most biodiverse areas, and this might be mildly true for bears. It's with a ham-shaped relationship for lynx, but actually it's not true for wolves. Wolves are basically there irrespectively of natural biodiversity intended as habitat biodiversity. And instead they are all affected by human population density. So if you want to understand a bit better what are the actual drivers of these patterns that we observe here, we can take into account the presence of habitat, in particular the percentage of forest, and the rate between natural vegetations and cropland that include also farmland. And we see that the presence of forest is definitely essential, very clearly, to all species. This graph here is almost the opposite of the bottom one. Whereas again, the rate between natural vegetation and croplands is not so evident. So it looks like if there is forest, then these animals can somehow cope with the presence of cropland and farmland. And this is sort of a good news. When we projected these relationship time-wise through time, we could basically have a projection in time that is now shown here in space of the presence of the different carnivores. So this is not the current distribution, but the prospective increase or decrease of the species. So you see the blue indicates an increase and the red a decrease. And you see that it's, there is a lot of blue, but there's also very many patches of red, especially for bears, locally in Trentino, and in some areas of Central Europe and the Alps for wolves. So it's predicted to be a decrease in this sense. So let's try to understand a little better what we are talking about by taking a regional local scale and going back to Trentino. And here really we have a story that has been shaped by the relationship between humans, their animals and wildlife. Their domesticated animals and wildlife. For a long time, my research center was placed on the top of a mountain just above Trento, which is called Viotte, the Monte Bondone. Basically, this was a high plain. It's a high plain, it's still a high plain. Geologically, it hasn't changed so far. Where there were some barracks from the militaries back in the war and the Austrian times. And in this postcard, you see the situation in the 50s. So this was like a huge resource for the inhabitants of the valley that would literally migrate alongside their cattle in summer to utilize these pastures and have a big feast every summer to celebrate the hay harvesting and the presence of cattle there. And then I took pretty much the same picture about 50 years later, so not that much after all. And you see that it has substantially changed because you still have some open areas that are little by little occupied by shrubs, but the limit of forest has largely expanded. And so this is just in a picture fashion what we have been saying before, so how the abandonment of traditional activities from humans may have influenced the landscape in a different way than what we are normally exposed to. So normally we say, oh, okay, so we are encroaching the environment, animals are pushed away, but Europe tells a bit of a more complex story. So if we reflect pretty much the same graphs that we saw before, but locally, we see that interestingly, humans have moved completely from the high mountains to the bottom of the valleys. So you see they decreased completely in the last 50 years from the altitudes down to the valley. So that's the opposite trend. And at the same time, the forest increased. So it's really like almost a direct relationship. As such, in Trentino, we observe that many wildlife species have actually increased. So it's a different story maybe from what you were expecting to hear from me. Large carnivores, but also several ungulates. And at the same time, the interest into hunting, so in a superpredation, in the direct effect of humans on wildlife has decreased. Maybe you're really waiting for this graph here. What were the consequences in terms of utilization of ungulates for the presence of predation on ungulates for the presence of wolves? For sure, the predation on different ungulates increased. And you can also see that there is some predation on livestock, that however, it's way less than the one on wild ungulates, considering that this is a huge underestimation because most of the prey that are predated in the wild, they're not tracked. And this is a very accurate estimate. So yes, there was a predation, an increase in the predation of livestock, but mild compared to the effect on wildlife species. And there is an interesting graph here showing the effect of predation according to the months in the year on wild ungulates and domesticated animals, and you see that basically it's only concentrated in summer, which is extensive traditional farming. So this is exactly what it was pointed at before. So yeah, there is an impact. It's relatively limited also because of some compensations and also some mitigation actions that I'm sure will be presented by the next speakers. I think it's interesting for us to understand whether this kind of pattern that we are observing is what we have learned in the books and in the documentaries that happened in the Yellowstone. So, okay, we had presence of resources and a lot of primary consumers, so elk. But then they introduced the wolf, and the elk reduced, and we don't know exactly what happened. Well, the picture that we see right now is actually very different. We don't observe a top-down mechanisms, rather a bottom-up mechanism. So it's more like there was a lot of forest that has been increasing because of humans moving away from certain environments. Therefore, the ungulates massively exploded, and these attracted large predators that, as we know, for what concerns the wolves, came on its own, so without any kind of introduction. So this is the picture that we can single out in Trentino. But let's also move to other types of challenges very quickly, but also I'm very honored to present this because it's been done together with a colleague that is, first of all, in animal science, Professor Maurizio Ramanzini of Padua. We looked into the fundamental niche of an iconic species, the ibex, that is also supposed to be in competition with the cattle grazing in the high altitudes. And here we just see the constrained fundamental niche. It's less related to the topic, but I think it's an important story to tell. We have studied with the CPS scholars the ibex in the Marmolada Massif, which is massively exposed to climate change. There was a very terrible accident just a little bit more 2 months ago with a big chunk of the glacier collapsing. So here what we observe is that the animals are actually able to spend their time differently according to the hour of the day. So what I'm showing here is basically what you normally observe in the cattle. So they tend to graze more in the morning and afternoon, late evening, and they avoid grazing when it's hotter during the day. So we have observed the same in wild animals. And we also saw that there is a form of compensation, there was a form of compensation so that somehow they would rest more for a longer time when the days were hotter. And somehow they were able to be preemptive, so to understand previously what was going to be. If it was going to be a hot day or a cool day. And the bad story, though, is that when ibex go beyond 14 degrees, their activity drops. So 14 degrees, it's basically what is for us 35. So it's really a moment in which our ability to cope decreases and heat stress comes up. Another aspect that we observed, and that again tells a story that is very similar to the traditional farming, is that animals are able to move up the altitude to find cool air. And that's linked to the good food that they find, which is the reason why extensive farming moves animals up in the mountains. We're observing the same with wild ungulates. But it's also a way to keep cool and to basically modify their presence of a few hundred meters during the day. And it's very clear how they go up when it's hotter. So what is the problem? The problem is that when the temperature increases, we have an increase in the altitude that is required to keep cool, about 100 meters in the forecast of the climate change panel. And the same, we can see that in the next 30 years, the number of days with that critical temperature, so 14 degrees, is going to be much higher in the mountains at the level where the ibex lives right now. So they will be basically constrained to expand their nocturnality, to live less in day hours, and also to move up. This is the Marmolada Massif, and you see that the red area is basically where they should move, and sometimes they are already at the top, they can't move anywhere, and sometimes they are basically would really need to go on vertical cliff where there is no food. And so we see that the adaptations of wildlife species is really constrained by climate change, and this is an aspect we have to consider when we do actions of coexistence. It's not only our direct effect in terms of activities, in terms of farming, in terms of presence, but it's also the overarching effect of climate change. So if we go to the local challenges, we see another type of effects. This time we really have to utilize the individual-based approach, and in particular the movement ecology paradigm. It's been observed in this paper we published in Science that the capacity to move, this is the capacity to move in 10 days, either on, as a median or for long movements, is inverse, has an inverse relationship with human footprint index. And here we have examples of increasing human footprint index. So we showed that animals are less able of long movements when we are really encroaching the environment. And why does this matter? So first of all, this on average means that some animals indeed move less, and so they become really adapted to our environments, urban environments, and they become a problem. For example, wild boar in the cities, or red fox in UK. So they really become part of our environment because they really adapt to move a little and utilize all our resources instead of going far and search for them. But also some other species that move a lot, they basically are not able to persist. So it's really a double side. And with a study from my student, we showed pretty much the same pattern with elk in the Yellowstone and red deer in Europe, where the animals basically, they would reach a threshold where they would basically adapt, trying to utilize, this is like an inverse index, to utilize the environment more and more specifically, so moving really in tortuosity, we say, so around and around to make the best of small patches, but at some point they are not able to utilize that anymore, and they are kind of stuck in the small fragments that we leave. Maybe we leave this. And we can see that specifically for roads that are a very clear infrastructural barrier. This study is based again on neuromammals, and it's on roe deer. We've shown that in all cases, the crossing of roads is really not something that they try to do. So they avoid to cross roads as much as they can. And we know how many roe deer can be found dead on roads because of impacts with vehicles. But yet, we have clearly shown that they are really, really a barrier for a species that we thought being very adapted to human environment. So there is this really controversial relationship between the capability to adapt, but also to, at some point, really crash in not being able to react anymore to our actions. And so that's what we call the human-constrained realized niche, if you remember the context. And this other example goes in this direction. It's on bears in Trentino again. We have basically shown that with respect to the habitat suitability models of presence in Trentino when the reintroduction was decided about 20 years ago, we find a way tighter availability of habitat when, and this is a bit of a funky thing, when we consider the presence of humans on path as they are tracked with the app that you can find on your phones, so the outdoor use of tracks. And this is, the redder the paths, the more utilized by humans for any kind of outdoor reasons. And these are the locations of the bed sites of bears. You see that they are really kind of carved into the pockets that we leave to them. And so clearly, maybe here there was a conflict, because if there is a person that passes here exactly when the bears move from one side to the other to find the bed site, maybe we have an encounter and we have a problems, we have a conflict. But we need to understand that this is the environment that they live. To conclude, I have a story from the lockdown, from the anthropos. We have been studying worldwide what happened to wildlife species when humans were at home, waiting for the first wave to be stabilized. When we studied bears about 15 years ago, we identified areas of crossing of the A22, which is the main highway in Trentino, the picture that I showed at the beginning, as being very relevant for them. But those crossings were never used, so we thought our model is wrong. But during lockdown, when our activity decreased, bears did cross exactly in the point that we predicted. So yeah, that was a very good connectivity point, but it couldn't be utilized because of human presence, because of traffic. It's not that they removed the highway, right, during lockdown, but we just had absence of traffic, absence of human presence, and that allowed the passages. Yeah, we can leave it at that. So we can, it's the same message, so I can leave it there. We can arrive to the conclusions. I suggest that it's important to address the problem of coexistence, to utilize animals' perspective as well, and in particular to consider humans as other competitors together with other species, especially for ungulates, and therefore to find that realized niche that allows the both to presence and persist and be in good welfare. We have to remember that abiotic factors, such as climate change, really shrink the possibility of adaptation under direct human competition. So we have to allow for this buffer, because animals and ourselves are already very much constrained by climate change. And to understand this, movement ecology is a very good area to potentially of easy intervention, because we can identify those gaps that are left aside, and also to study the direct interaction between humans, farm animal, and wildlife species. We have subtracted habitats, as the chair already outlined, so that the interface between humans and wildlife has become very thin. And this is why we observe conflict, because the capability for animals to move when they would like, to utilize resources when they would like, is very much reduced, not only by the reduction of habitat, but also by our presence. However, the good news is that animals are still behaviorally plastic, as the lockdown has shown, so we still have the possibility to mitigate, both for the persistence of wildlife species and for the sustainability of our actions. And I didn't see, the presentation of the chair before, but the solution has to be a One Health perspective, where we leave room to animals and allow to keep biodiversity, while aiming at increasing the resilience of the system, and specifically to decrease the spillover of diseases. Studies on direct and indirect impacts of humans should be combined to find viable mitigation solutions, both for human health and biodiversity, and as well as coexistence, which is the topic that will be addressed by the next speakers. So I have so many to thank you for listening, my colleagues, collaborators. There would be too many symbols, too many faces. So I decided to utilize one picture from the lockdown time with the masks, so anyone could be there. We cannot recognize. And I also, while I thank you, leave you a few images of wildlife as we observe them from camera trapping. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Francesca, for this very, very interesting presentation. Now we will move to our next speaker, if I can find the slide. Well, it will come up for me. Our next speaker is Dr. Christian Gortazar. Christian holds a PhD in veterinary medicine, and he is now a professor in animal health at the Spanish National Wildlife Institute, Eaap. This is a joint center between the University of Castilla-La Mancha and the Spanish National Research Council, CSIC, in Spain, which deals with conservation and management of wildlife and their habitats. Here, Christian heads the research group on health and biotechnology, and his expertise in wildlife epidemiology and disease control has resulted in a large number of grants and scientific publications and PhD theses. His research activity combines ecology and veterinary sciences to provide solutions to emerging health problems such as tuberculosis or the African swine fever. So today he will be speaking to us about sanitary aspects regarding the coexistence between wildlife and livestock. So thanks very much, Christian.
Okay, so very good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Isabel, Andrea, and everybody for inviting me as a representative of the Eaap Institute. I will start fast, and already Nuno Canada addressed one of the problems that we are facing. We are in the middle of a global crisis that is not going to change fast. This global crisis is a crisis that has to do with the limited resources and the levels we are reaching of overuse of resources such as water, such as energy, but also the consequences of this overuse, which are reflected, for instance, in the biodiversity crisis, which somehow was already addressed by the previous speaker. And this global crisis gives place to some specific ones. For instance, the COVID-19 crisis that we experienced in the last couple of years, that in turn had a strong effect on several other infectious disease-related problems, including animal health related ones. And now we are not over with COVID-19, and we already have the next crisis, which is the invasion of Ukraine. So in these times of crisis, we have, of course, less resources for health, we have less resources for research, and we really need to be even more realistic and more clever to try to avoid all the negative consequences that we are going to face in the coming years. Which includes also the farming crisis that we are facing all over Europe. That's the reality. What is going on with farming in Europe, and what has this to do with wildlife? Well, first thing is farming is of course relevant. There is a lot of farmed animals, you know it. Here you have a nice map by species and a nice distribution that also shows how relevant animal farming is in Spain within the European context. But the concept that this is growing in Europe is wrong. As you perfectly know, the numbers of farmed animals are generally reasonably stable within the European Union. And in fact, with the farming crisis, it is likely that some sectors will witness a decline in the next years. So rather than the numbers, what is changing is the way we are farming. We have changed historically from traditional farming to industrial indoor farming, and now there is another trend that goes from industrial indoor to industrial outdoor. And all this has tremendous effects on the disease risks that are associated. Okay, and so I enter the field I'm going to address today. In the European farming, animal farming environment, we have different situations that live together. And it's actually not just two, it's rather a gradient of different situations. One extreme would be the highly biosafe, very modern animal production facilities. For instance, think of poultry or think of pigs. And the other extreme would be free-range cattle or free-range poultry or pigs in different situations. Diseases are very important in these contexts, in both of them. And there are many. There are production-related diseases. There are endemic diseases, like tuberculosis, for instance. There are lots of emerging diseases. And there is also an antimicrobial resistance, which is a completely new actor, but also going to stay in this system. So thinking about animal science, animal production, and thinking about the different diseases that are relevant in this field, what is the role of wildlife there? And without intending to draw attention from the next speaker, also how can science help? Let me introduce this a bit in the second part of the presentation. So, but the main part will be on the role of wildlife. What is the role of wildlife in this context? Well, first message is, and this coincides very much with what Francesca told us in her presentation, the EU livestock is not growing anymore. It's changing, but not growing so much. But a few wildlife species are. Which wildlife species are growing? Essentially opportunistic, generalistic species that benefit from the change that we are causing to the habitat. They may benefit from anthropogenic subsidies, agriculture, residues, also feeding in some cases. They may benefit from anthropogenic habitat change. Mostly we have more woodlands, so we have more ungulates, for instance. And there is also a progressive abandonment of wildlife management that we will see later on. So the consequence of this is that nowadays wildlife is not something far away in the mountains. It is something that lives with us very, very close. And in fact, you can find roe deer, for instance, on 74% of the European surface. You can find red deer on 35% of the European surface, and you can find wild boar on 64% of this surface. And probably this is an underestimation, so probably the percentage is even higher. And the numbers are high too. And if we try to map the overlap between the wildlife abundance and the livestock distribution, then you find this kind of interface maps that are now starting to come out essentially through a strong European initiative that is funded by the European Food Safety Agency, the EFSA, where there is an intention to follow up wildlife numbers and to map wildlife densities and to try to identify the regions and the situations where this overlap between wildlife and livestock is more close. And the consequence of this close proximity is, of course, interaction. And interaction is risky, and there is disease transmission when this interaction occurs. But a very, very important concept that will pop up every now and then during this presentation is that this interaction doesn't need to be direct as the one on the picture. It can just be indirect. For instance, here you have the movements, more movement ecology, of a wild boar close to a pig farm in northern Spain. There is no African swine fever in that place, but if there was African swine fever, this very close contact of a wild reservoir with a potential domestic host is, of course, a big risk, because there may be means of pathogen exchange between the wild and the domestic population. This is because some wildlife populations may act as what we call bridge hosts, so hosts that are able to build the bridge, to form the bridge between the wild habitats and the domestic habitats. This is something that is now being studied by Alberto Sanchez, a student of Eaap. He's tagging a number of peri-domestic species, like the starling here on the picture, and showing how the starling is linking, this single individual is linking a river, a city, a poultry farm, a pig farm, a cattle farm, and so on. So if the starling does have a contact with, for instance, a Salmonella or a E. coli with an antimicrobial resistance gene, he may transfer these genes over different farm ecosystems and over different urban human-inhabited ecosystems. So this is a bridge species. So the rule of wildlife is somehow synthesized in this picture. If the species is susceptible to a given infection, then for sure they are indicators. So they are always interesting to observe, because we may find there is contact with some disease, and this should ring the alarm bell and should tell us what to do. But then they are always indicators, but they may be bridge hosts, like the example of the starling. They may be reservoirs, like the example of the wild boar, or they may be victims, like it happens right now with a lot of water birds, a lot of seabirds in particular, that are experiencing high mortalities because of emerging avian influenza. So the rules of wildlife may differ, but the relevance of wildlife regarding shared infections is always a high one. I like to call these kind of interface infections or shared infections, because they are not belonging to one of the compartments. They are not, there is no good and bad. There is no the bad wildlife and the good domestic animals, or vice versa, depending on who is looking at the picture. It is just both are sharing the problem. Examples, you know them, they are listed there. What do they have in common? In general, there are no vaccines available, although there will be big changes in the next years, I'm sure. Most of them, if not all, are emerging, or at least re-emerging, so they are changing in their distribution and changing in their host pattern. And our main tool for working with this problem is biosafety and prevention. Let me very shortly show you two examples. First one is, of course, African swine fever, which the pig industry knows pretty well, and where the wild boar is clearly one of the main actors. This is a simple disease in the sense that there is just one host, the pig, and its wild form, the wild boar. The problem is, as Francesca has shown, the explosion of, in this case, the wild boar population all over Europe and all over the distribution area of wild boar and feral pigs in the world, because of this anthropogenic habitat change. And this explosion of the host population has, of course, led to an explosion of the disease in both domestic animals and in wildlife all over Europe and most continents already of the world. African swine fever is re-emerging in Europe. It is endemic where the entry occurred as an epidemic front, like in the Baltic countries and Poland, or like in southeastern Europe. There are a bit better prospects in places where a focal introduction occurred, like in the Czech Republic and in Belgium. Well, the local outbreaks were already cleared, fortunately. But then there are big jumps, like the one that happened within Poland and then into Germany. There are more recent jumps into Italy, as you all know, and some others. So it's really a big concern. So what happens when this African swine fever enters into a wildlife population? There is a very, very nice story from Estonia, where you can see it in these maps there. The disease entered from the southeast, and there were lots of cases, all the blue dots there on the top map. Then in the central map, you see the spread all over the Estonian mainland. And then in the next year, you see the disease is mostly present in the north and in the west, including one of the large islands. But the point is that you still see a few blue dots in the original entry sites. So the disease is surviving despite very low population densities of wild boar, because after the disease enters, there is a very strong mortality. How does this happen? Well, there must be different mechanisms, and we have been trying to understand these mechanisms through modeling. There must be direct transmission, there must be environmental transmission, carcass-mediated, and probably there is some kind of survivors even over the short term, which means By using these mechanisms, there is the possibility of disease maintenance. The important thing is, if you have disease maintenance over such a long time in this kind of species, the likelihood of jumping into the peak population is unfortunately very high. So what can you do about this? There is a lot of discussion in EFSA and in other European agencies and everywhere, I guess, in the world. The tools are very limited. Right now, you can do monitoring, you can do work on prevention and biosafety, you can do population control, and for now, there is no vaccination, but let's hope there will be some in the future. So, first case. Second case study, tuberculosis. This is an example of an endemic disease where wildlife reservoirs, wildlife hosts are very, very important. And in this case, this is not at all a single host disease. There is no just the swine and the wild boar. No, here we have a lot of different wildlife species depending on the place of the world. We have a lot of non-bovine domestic hosts that are also participating in the epidemiology depending on the place. Goats, pigs, or even sheep may be important in TB epidemiology. And different species play different rules, but at the end, these rules are complementary. This is a collaboration with Nuno Santos, a colleague from here, from Portugal, who calculated the different rules of wild boar, red deer, and other species in maintaining tuberculosis. They are not the same, but they add to each other to make it more efficient, to make it more likely that tuberculosis survives over time. And in fact, what we find is that those communities, those situations where there are more different species involved in maintaining a given disease are much more resilient, are much more likely to make the disease survive, the infection survive over time than those communities where there is just a single host or two hosts. And this brings me to the important question, if we are targeting the right hosts. Right now, in Europe, over 90% of the resources that are available for tuberculosis control are spent into cattle tuberculosis control, which is fine. But then we are leaving only less than 10% for controlling tuberculosis in all the other species where there is most of the infection circulating. So maybe we need a bit to change the concept. A very important point in this regard is how the disease is transmitted. In African swine fever, you need blood. We can discuss about vectors, still blood, but you need a blood contact or direct contact, okay, with a carcass, with whatsoever. In TB, that's not needed. You just need a water hole, a drinker, a feeding place, whatever, where there is some contamination and where indirect contact between species can take place. So we are now going very much into depth into trying to understand how this transmission occurs. For this, we are using camera trapping grids. We use these grids, of course, for calculating abundances of different wildlife species. We can calculate how many wild boar, how many red deer, how many roe deer, how many foxes there are in a certain point. But also, we can calculate the interactions because each camera sees different species. So we can calculate the frequency of seeing these different species, and we can figure out the host communities of meso and larger mammals. And we can, within these communities, look at which are the species that are linked to a certain infection, for instance, tuberculosis, and how are the contacts between them, which species are more in contact with each other. And in this case, what we find all over Spain is that there is a high frequency of contact between wild boar and red deer. And when you look at these contacts, and when you plot them along with TB prevalence in this host community, you find that the places where there is more interaction are the places where there is higher TB prevalence. So the community structure and the interaction between members of the community is even more important than just the density of the individuals. So for TB, this is a multi-host disease, and this is a disease where interspecies transmission is indirect. Both things very important. So how would we control TB or any other disease? Well, first thing is you need to diagnose the community. You need to understand what is the system, who is participating, and then use all the available tools. There may be vaccination in the future, not right now in the European community, but in the UK they are pushing for vaccination, so things will change in the next future. You have test and cull, which is what we are using in cattle in general, and you have biosafety. Use them all. And when you use these tools, think of all the hosts. Don't think of just one. Don't think of just the cattle. Think of the whole host community. And then also, we haven't time to address this, but consider the relevant stakeholders, and in particular, consider the farmers. We are too often working with diseases in wildlife and in domestics without considering the farmers at all, and that's of course totally wrong. So now coming to the end, very shortly, just a first address of what to do and how science can help in this context. The first thing is try to organize your disease, your situation. What is your host community? Make your epidemiological diagnosis, make your picture of the situation, and then decide, are you taking action or not? In this kind of relevant diseases I'm addressing, you certainly are going for intervention. And if you are going for intervention, you just have 4 options: monitoring, prevention, population control, and vaccination. That's it. There is nothing else. Monitoring, what does it mean? It means integrated monitoring, monitoring the disease, but also monitoring the hosts. And monitoring the domestic hosts, that's relatively easy because you have the numbers, but monitoring wildlife is not so easy, and this is why EFSA is pushing for this kind of Europe-wide mammal and bird surveillance to have the denominator numbers to assess the risks. In prevention and biosafety, there is so much to do, and I think there is a lot of progress in recent years, particularly in the extensive cattle breeding systems, the beef cattle breeding systems, where there are means to assess the risks, there are procedures to make an analysis of the situation of every specific farm, and there are recommendations for the farmers that can be downloaded from the internet and that farmers can use to improve and to reduce and to mitigate the risks that have been identified. So now it is a matter of expanding all these to other systems, to other production systems, to other species, and of course to other diseases too. Regarding population control, that's a big field and a very conflictive one, but just the message would be think of recreational hunting as one tool in the box. So don't discard it, just think it could be one tool that you could use eventually, depending on the disease, depending on the situation, and depending on the needs that there are. And then there is vaccination, and there will be, I'm sure, big changes, not just regarding TB, also regarding African swine fever, probably also regarding many other diseases, if we think of the possibilities of using vaccination even for improving your immune capacity and using the concept of trained immunity for maybe fighting against disease agents in a more holistic way and in a way that combines maybe with some other more efficient methods of from the field of animal science that we could combine in this regard. So this is more or less the end of the talk. Remember, we have several crises in sight, not just one. And in this context, we really need to focus our attention on the 2 or 3 main points we can possibly address. If I would like to give you 3 messages to take home, the first one would be, forget about single hosts, think about the communities. Wherever you face a problem with a disease, think which species are participating, which domestic species, which wild species, and how are their interactions, and how can you play with these interactions to reduce or to mitigate the problem. Second message, clearly is use all the tools that you have available. Don't think that just with biosafety you are safe. No, biosafety is absolutely needed, but it is also absolutely needed to consider population control if needed, of the domestics or of the wild. Depends on the situation. And consider vaccination whenever this is a possibility, and push for vaccination even if it is not a possibility, because the no is just a political no in some cases. And Of course, and as I said, I was not able to address this, but it's a very, very important point. I think it will be addressed in one of the later presentations. Involve the farmers in disease control, involve them even in decision making. Stop all this top-down regulation of animal disease, start to use also some bottom-up experience from the farming sector. And with this, thank you very much. Obrigado.
Thanks very much, Christian, for this very enlightening talk. It seems we have the recipe. Let's see if we can make it work. Our next speaker today, before the coffee break, will be Dr. Klemen Jerina. Klemen is a professor of wildlife ecology and management at the Biotechnical Faculty of the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. His research focuses on biology, ecology, conservation, and management of large carnivores and large herbivores in Eurasia, especially in Central Europe and the Balkans. Most of his work has been dedicated to brown bear, grey wolf, red and roe deer, wild boar, chamois, and Barbary sheep, and to a lesser degree to other game and protected species. His latest studies deal with applied issues important for fostering the coexistence, management, and conservation of wildlife, such as understanding the causes of human-wildlife conflicts and the means for their prevention, the benefits and downsides of artificial feeding, the effects and importance of selective hunting, and the sound management of wild populations in European multi-use landscapes. So, Klemen, please, thanks very much. And we have to thank especially Klemen for the effort, because he has been stuck at Lisbon Airport this whole night, and he has just arrived in Porto an hour ago. So, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for a nice introduction. And before starting, I'd like really to thank to the organizing committee, to Andrea, to inviting me here, and also to my colleague, another Klemen, to link us together. So the beginning was quite stressful, 30 years since I came last time here, but I really look forward to stay for another week. So my talk will be much more practical compared to previous one. But both previous speakers give really nice introduction. So basically, as it was announced, I worked as a professor for wildlife ecology management, also the wildlife planning, and also teach hunting and so on. So all the issues with studying and managing the bigger mammals, wild mammals in our landscape. So I do that actually since I was a student. But otherwise, I originate from one small village in mountains, half mountains in Slovenia. So for me, it's really the most beautiful one I've ever seen. But I heard that that'll be a challenge. And since I remember, actually, for example, species such as brown bear lived around us, wolf, we have lynx now again, wild boar is common, red deer, roe deer. So basically, this part of the life gave me this practical dimension. So basically, what you learn that you cannot move the things forward without the agreement of all the participants in the story, and without making basically the compromises. So the science can give really good, sharp answers. It can reveal where it's worthy to go, but if those answers are not accepted by people, you're on the dead end. And sometimes you have to make quite big compromises, and basically to train and evolve with people. So what my talk will be about, in order to diminish the conflict between the breeding of the animal, domestic animals, and the wildlife, it depends where you go into Europe, and also how much cooperation you have with the hunters. And for example, okay, I'll go into that later, but in Slovenia, and especially in the parts of Europe where they have German hunting school, it's quite easy to involve the hunters in your story. So basically, they like to follow, okay, they need knowledge, and sometimes they're really stubborn in their ideas, but you can move them. But then, of course, hunting is important. Control hunting, even it can be performed as a recreational hunting, but with really strict frames. It can be an important tool to control the conflict between wildlife and people, but not to abuse this tool. We have to be aware that wildlife still brings a lot of benefits. You have a lot of ecological and economical roles, positive, not just negative. So the first part of my talk will be short, really brief overview of that. I hope I'll not be too much lective. And then I'll try to synthesize the main type of the conflict between wildlife and breeding of domestic animals. Of course, here I'll not be able to be completely objective. I come from a specific country and I build my world of experience in specific part of the world, but I'll do my best. And both at the same time, I'll try to give really short overview what works and what doesn't work according to the best knowledge we have. And by the same time, I'll also try to provide some legislative aspects. So, for example, sometimes hunting is just not allowed as a population mean, or you have the stories where you can do if it's justified. And with some species, you can have it almost unlimited. It depends on the local society and acceptance. Of course, you cannot exterminate species, but it can be an important tool. So, to beginning with the role, so why basically we need the species in order to function. It's quite clear, but all the plants, in order to survive, they need space and they need nutrients, and they build it in, and on long term, the animals release it back in the system. Okay, somebody would say now we have like 10 times more domestic animals than wildlife, but still we have the natural environments where you need the wildlife in order to release these nutrients out, though they're energetic turnover, so how much energy do they turn of the, for example, ungulates, it's much, much smaller compared to everything else which cooperates in the broader sense of the decomposition. They can still enhance it strongly because they urinate, they can dig, they can move around, they can select, so they are important and they do their benefits. Then the second role, which is much less obvious, and also it's more done exclusively by the wildlife in our ecosystems, it's transport of the nutrients. So basically in a lot of ecosystems all over the world, you have certain species which do it. So basically they take it where you have the more in the lowland and bring it somewhere higher up in the terrestrial ecosystem, in the sea ecosystem. They take it at the bottom of the ocean or on the top of the ocean and bring it into the continents. But they do it. So why they do it? Because basically the predators take care that this is going on. So for example, red deer, if they would eat and sleep at the same location, somewhere near the valley, now the people wouldn't tolerate it, but traditionally the wolf wouldn't do it. So basically they select their feeding sites where they maximize their intake of the energy, where it's easiest to get, but basically that's your area. I know more about that than me, probably even. And then they rest somewhere where it's more safe to rest. Often that's higher up because you have better overview, and also they disperse more. And by moving on daily basis and year after year, several species, long distance, they bring back nutrients. And globally, they can really strongly affect on long term where you have the more and where less. And in some ecosystems, for example, it can be really big proportion of all the nitrogen was transported by the ungulates, or, for example, in aquatical by the salmon, and so on. So how this practically goes, my village, I'll turn back to it more often. So daytime, you have blue location, it's the bottom of the karst valley, and nighttime, vice versa. Blue dots are nighttime, but I'm not sure, so this is the pointer. No. Okay, now I think I know. Can you put it back? Sorry. So okay, thank you. Sorry. So night location. It's the bottom of the valley where they feed, often also people don't accept that, so they basically compete with us to take the grass, and then the rest somewhere higher, and they transmit, they transport the nutrients while moving around, and on the end, it's really a huge amount of it. Then, of course, you have the zoochory, so transport of seeds. This is really important for the species which have heavier seeds, because wind cannot, for example, blow up the chestnut or, I don't know, the coconuts. It would be terrible if it could happen, but animals do it, and do it really much less, so they bring the seeds in the same ecosystem where they were taken out, so you need less seeds, and it's efficient. You have different system, how it goes. It can go through the animal, endozoochory, epizoochory, or synzoochory. We often forget about this role of the animal, as long as you don't lose it, or as long as somebody doesn't want to commercialize our way how to do it. So, for example, now we have huge fires in over Europe, and one of the really popular way how to solve it, how to regenerate the forest, is to use the seed bombs with the drones. It sounds fantastic, and you need it in some areas, but in preserved landscapes, most of Europe still have it. You have natural drones which do that perfectly well. As long as you maintain them, of course, you have them. Of course, disposal is not important just for transmitting the seed per se, but also to release to transport the gene in the space, and some animals do it without purpose, really long term. Maybe this picture has been shown before, but that's one case of the long distance dispersal of the wolf from Slovenia to Italy, and it's enormous difference they do. And then finally, okay. Is this better? Yeah, sorry, I forgot my size. So, of course, the species also eat, and they eat selectively. They browse, for example, or they control the other species, and basically within a group of wildlife, like ungulates or predators, you always have a species which actually controls all the others. It's a key species in the ecosystem, and it can reshape it a lot. For example, I know in our ecosystem, when the deer go up, it can change the forest, abeti fagetum, so we fur beech forest into the almost pure beech forest, which has completely different ecology, and also economically is different. And then, of course, you have also direct benefits for people, like trophy hunting, hunting for meat, and then watching of the animals, not from Slovenia, and processing the meat. And one really important fun, maybe some of you will not accept it, but aspect is not fun, but actually living a nice life. So it's actually occupying a lot of people to do it, both hunters and the people who enjoy just watching the animals. So that's why we need them. But of course, not everything is nice. You also have conflicts, like, for example, the one that previous talker talked about. So they're more not as obvious, like transmission of diseases. But you also have direct one that you face on daily basis, like damage, killed animals, or I don't know, eating the hay, destroying the crops, and so on. So before going to the main conflict types, I'd just like to give some background on basically on legislative part, and also how the hunting system works. So in Europe in generally, you have like two major applied rules how the hunting is organized. It's actually, it's saying, it's deciding the property of the animal. So following the old Roman law, you have the res nullius property. So basically animal is nobody property, but it was not because they would be so highly, they would have so high thoughts about the animal, the Romans, but because they were good lawyers, and they were clear that you cannot basically own something which move around. But with this res nullius system, which is applied in the mostly Western countries, so the animal is nobody property, but the hunting rights usually are related with the ownership of the land. This goes from Roman law. And then, of course, if the ownership of the hunting rights is related with the ownership of the land, then the damages are actually the stuff that owner should resolve usually. If he doesn't license the hunting rights, then he gives this resolution of the damages also to the one that gets the hunting rights. And you have, in general, you have a big weaker system of monitoring of the wildlife. And what's interesting, so although the conflicts are much higher here, that I'll describe here, as if you would listen to the people, in generally, when you measure the damages on average, they're a bit higher here, because of course, if the damage happens in your property and it's your animal, you'll accept it easier. So the other system which is applied is res communis system. So here, basically, the government owns the animal and then gives the hunting rights. She has it and then give it or sell it to the people. And here, the hunting club is responsible for the damages later, and usually they help to resolve the damages and so on. And in some countries, for example, like Slovenia, they're also highly involved in monitorings and so on. So they're really eager to cooperate because they're afraid to lose them. So this system actually decides how the hunting species, so the species which you hunt on a daily basis or are allowed to be hunted, are regulated. But then we have also pan-European legislation on protected species, Habitats Directive. And for example, large predators are listed there. And you can have them on different lists on different parts of the Europe, but still, it's not that each country could decide its own rules. So basically, you have the common negotiation. It's quite different. But still, even that species depends on which country do they live, because this system affects how those species are managed. So, for example, the large predators are doing better in the res communis countries because people don't feel they own the animal. That was the study showed that. So now going to the main part of the presentation, so which are the conflicts. So one common, obvious to everybody who works with land farmers is rooting of grassland. Different species can do it. So it's not much written about that. Just few countries actually recognize this as a legal problem. But the main species they do it, it's wild boar. It was a species which was evolutionary perfectly built up to make it. So it has low body, strong legs, and they can turn around like small stadium, one family, one pack of the wild boar over the night. They do that to search for the food, either for invertebrates or for the roots of the plants. And by doing that, of course, they decrease the production of these meadows on long term, and you cannot use them to collect the hay, or it's harder to graze the animal there. And then locally, in some countries, for example, as Slovenia, even the brown bear do it they search for species of bugs, they do differently, or badger, but the most important species is wild boar. So what you can do with that, so one of the major measure which is commonly applied in most of the countries, if possible, is pressure to increase but that's just for the wild boar, of course, so it's tension to increase the wild boar population control. It works a little bit, so both variables are related. Higher density of the wild boar, bigger probability of rooting, but of course you can have, even with extremely low density wild boar population, you can have huge outbreaks of the rooting activity, for example, especially in the year of Melilonta gradation. And then fencing, it would work theoretically, but it's not economically payoff. Diversionary feeding doesn't work. It has been tested, and then we also tested, for example, protein and vitamin additives, which is really popular, so it's huge commercial bay on that. You add it to the corn that you feed to the wild animals, but at least our experiment didn't confirm, so we had zero effect, so no additives actually worked. So depending on what's the reason for this rooting. So if the reason is basically searching for the roots of the plants, you just have population control, or of course you ask the hunters to try to resolve that by putting the meadow back. But if you have this Melilonta or other invertebrate gradation, you have quite nice relation between using the manure and rooting activities, because manure, from natural manure, probably increase the density, or it does increase the density of the invertebrates. So basically it brings the food there. So you have trade-off, more more rooting activity or less smaller production. But here with this rooting, we have to be aware also that it can be also beneficial from wild boar in some circumstances. For example, it's helped to control the melonota, or you need it to regenerate the degraded forest with strong understory. The other type of conflict, which is just recognized as a conflict or as a damage in few countries in Europe, it's grazing on grassland. It's done by all the ungulates, for example, and the larger one, so red deer is the most common species which do it because it feeds on grasses, and it's also, they live in bigger herds during the time when most damages is performed. And also the damadama could be there, and roe deer, but roe deer is much less important, though people would like to blame it, but it mostly feeds on herbs and it lives much more dispersed. So basically it has close to zero effect, at least by our studies. So this type of conflict or damage is extremely hard to evaluate. So basically in Slovenia we had certain period, and even in Croatia it has quite similar story. So a lot of farmers start to press, try to collect some money, reimbursement money due to these damages, and they reported the damages like 50, 60, 70%. So that was their impression. And then when we start to measure what's the reality actually, so the average drop of the production of the hay in the high density area of red deer in Slovenia was less than 10%. But at the same sentence, you would have some owners, for example, which lives in the extremely remote areas surrounded by the forest, big density of the red deer around, and just one meadow. Such meadows can have over 30, 50% of loss of the hay production. So it can be a problem locally, but definitely not globally. And in the other parts where you have no red deer, it's almost no effect. So this type of damage is legally recognized as damage just few countries in Europe. It's perceived by the owners usually. And what's the biggest issue is if you want to compensate, usually the cost of the damage estimate, and the really only good method is by using the cages. So to exclude the animal is much more expensive than the damage per se. So you cannot solve it like that. So what was our advice then? So basically to few owners that we recognize that they really have few Eaap impacts by the red deer. So we basically were able to negotiate with local hunters, so they provide the hay back to them, and didn't go into the estimates of what the real damage is. Otherwise you would have a lot of consumption of the money just by estimating what's the damage. And then of course, fencing, theoretically it would work, but it's too expensive. The diversionary feeding doesn't work because the animals are not at feeding sites anymore when they do this type of damage. Repellents also, you can't use them on such scale. So one of the means which works is actually establishment of the alternative pastures. So basically you provide some grazing area just for the wildlife and then maintained by the hunters, but you need a lot of organization to do that. Increased culling would work, but of course if you would increase culling for every damage or every conflict, on the end we would lose wildlife. So basically that's not general recipe. And then again you have the decreased fertilization, because basically the biggest intrusion or the biggest impact is on the meadows which are higher on nutrients. The animals know where to go to feed. So in most situations the damages are localized, and basically after they start, they maintain these meadows in higher nutrient stage for longer periods. So one option to resolve, so to decrease the conflict, is actually to go more extensive. But if, of course, the owners should accept that. Then when we go further is damage to the crops. So the extent of money paid for the damages by the wildlife, usually this overcomes all the other by several folds. So between different cultures, the corn is most important, but you have it also on all the other weeds. The corn, I'll explain later, because it's so high the animal can go in. And then this corn or crops are exposed in different stages. It starts when you plant already the seeds. So in order, for example, to produce the feed for the animal, you and the corn, and a lot different species of birds start to go after that. For example, so crows and black crows and bluebird go for it, but the most important is hooded crow in many parts of Europe. So one of the common way, the archaic way, how they wanted to resolve this conflict was to expose the corpse of that animal, which was killed somewhere close or there in that field, and that should actually work as a tremendous repellent on all the others. It's really controversial, but we said, okay, it's done already, so why not to test it? And we did a test, and we compared how this works compared to, for example, the silhouettes of the dead crows or silhouettes of the predators or just random control, and basically it turned out that those birds are not effective, so they have zero effect or similar effect as presence of people who maintain this trap. So basically it doesn't work, but what works actually, and we learned that not by chance, but we also had kind of experiment, do the hunting, not in order to hunt the animals, but if you're present there, the animals would go away. Of course, it's not recipe which could be used on everywhere, but with some owners, especially if they're hunters, they can help themselves. So it's not purpose to kill the animals, but just to be there to scare away, because those species crows are really intelligent, and they remember where the threat is, and they'll avoid using that areas, meaning they'll go somewhere else. Of course, this is not acceptable everywhere. And then you have the damage to the crops in later stages when you want to pick them up. Again, here the wild boar, due to their population densities, but also due to their living habits, is single one species which do this kind of damages in the corn, and corn is especially exposed because they can go in and stay there for a longer time. Then red deer is also important in some parts, and for example in parts of the more forested part of Europe where you have bears, even the bears, and then all the other species which feeds with weeds and corns, but wild boar and red deer are number one species. So you have for example, we tested, or different systems has been tested. Electric fences here works, but if they're maintained really well for the wild boar, they have to be really good taken care for, otherwise they don't work. But the economics can be questionable. But also sound and chemical deterrent has been tested, and for example, we had the sound deterrents for the wild boars around cornfield in Slovenia, and the result was basically they kicked them down the first night, so it doesn't help. They wanted to get rid of them. Then population control also is important. In generally smaller density of the boar or red deer, you'll have less damage overall, but still you can have huge outbursts from this general rule. So clearances between the fields and the forest, so basically we want to remove the security between the damaged object and the forest where the animals are in. That also partially help if you can move it. And then in several countries, diversionary feeding was suggested as really effective, and hunters, for example, use them massively in order to decrease this type of conflict. But in generally, at least, for example, judging from the studies that you did in Slovenia, they have zero effect or even opposite effect, because basically, as long as the corn is not ripe, the wild boar will stay inside the forest, for example, around feeding site, and immediately when it will be ripe, it will go in and stay there over entire month, as long as the corn will not be picked up. And here we had one case, for example, one female, we GPS colored it, it was inside the cornfield, and then hunters organized, they want to push it out. And when they started, basically before they come to the end of the field, the pig was inside, back in, so it stayed in. So the only way, the only situations when you can, when feeding actually helps, if you basically move around, you have to really learn the animals, learn their behavior, and if you can move them around the forest, basically steal their time. And it's not applicable in all the situation. You can solve the situation, but in general, it's no solution. So to go further, the most obvious and usually also most publicly hot type of the conflict is the predation of the domestic animal. So large predators. Wolf is the most important species that with the most conflict, and it doesn't kill just one, but several, or 10, 20, 30 animals per once, which actually elevate the perception. Then brown bear can be also damaging in some situation on a smaller scale, but still. And then jackal on the small animals, on the younger one. Lynx in some countries with newborns, in wild boar from in extreme densities could actually, it does do so. Before going into the mitigation efforts here, I'd like to give a few words about which breeds or which species of the domestic animals are most exposed. So for example, if you go to the horses or cows, similar species or the species that those species were domesticated from actually has a long history of coevolution with the predators in our landscape. So basically they're better deterring them. So in general you have much less conflicts with them or smaller rate of depredation. And then the sheep actually didn't have any bigger, larger predators in their environment where they were growing up. So if it's ordered to substitute one species with the other, that's a big portion of solution. But you cannot always apply it, of course. And then to go further, again, the most obvious or the most common type of resolution which is suggested by people is to kill the conflict animals or to get rid of them all. And basically the wolf is protected species by Habitats Directive, depending how strong. So here it's on Annex 5, I believe, in Portugal. So it's treated as game species, but in major part of the Europe is strictly protected. So hunting is not actually acceptable generally. And given that wolves live in pack and pack is covering entire country, entire area, their area, even if you decrease the densities, the overall damages will not drop out. But it works if, for example, certain packs specialize on the predation, then by removing that pack, it will help. And we had, for example, situations like that, but it's not generally. And then with brown bear, they have quite different behavior. So basically, they're not territorial, and their densities can increase quite for a certain time. This picture is not from Slovenia, it's from somewhere from Russia or Ukraine. It was stolen. But we have huge debates how to go on with brown bear because of not just conflicts on the predation of the domestic animal, but the largest type of conflict is the intrusion of the animal into the villages, fear of people, increasing direct attacks. So basically the bears which are not afraid of people anymore and they live in the villages. And it's related to the population control. So what has been going on? So basically brown bears, they have really strong social hierarchy. So you have dominant males and then females, and males can kill but the offsprings of the other males. So you have infanticide. And in order to decrease it, the females tend to, during the mating period, they move away from the presence of the dominant male. So basically they end up in the vicinity of people because they're less afraid of people than compared to the dominant male. And due to this social dominance, and if you have long-term process, the animals slowly start to move from wilder areas into the areas where you have more people. And that actually has been going on in Slovenia for the last 20 years. So previously, we would just have bears in these huge forest blocks, but then in the last 10, 15 years, the densities, even in the areas where you have more villages, basically you have scattered villages all around, increased, and even our telemetry data show that basically bears stopped avoiding people, so they're doing it much less. And our proposed resolution was, because there is nothing else that could be done and the conflict level increased terribly, is basically to increase the culling here. So overall, just to decrease the population size from 1,000 to 800, which is the biggest density we know recorded in literature, but we had quite big quarrels with law, but now actually the law accepted, so it went through with our judge. So even it's protected species, it's no other solution instead of culling. But of course, it's in the area which is colonized by people. And that's one way. So here we'll decrease the conflict. I have to hurry. Then of course, but the only real solution generally to decrease the conflict with, so the predation of the domestic animal, sheep, goat, and so on, is to use the mitigation measures such as fences. They have to be high, really strong, maintained properly, or guarding dogs, which is much higher, much more difficult to maintain, or for example, for the bees, electric flares. And for example, how effective this is. In Slovenia, when we started with that with one big project in 2010, in few years we were able to more than half the depredation rate of the sheep, though the number of the wolf increased at the same time. But at the same time, so if this is not done properly, you'll have no effect because all these species are really fast learners. So for example, just a few clips before I end from one of our study areas where the owners slowly improved their system of fencing. So we would have repeated depredations, even the nets were nice, and what was the case? So we found out that there is one called professional where it's near the village, electric fence with really high voltage. So the impression was it will go away, but at the same night, and then he got his reward already. Sorry for being too long. It was too short night to be really concentrated. Maybe it will be some time for the question later.
I'm a bit shorter than Klemen, I'm afraid. Thanks very much, Klemen. You haven't been too long. We just were a bit late. So please, I would like to ask you to be back here at 10 past 11 sharp so that we can continue with our last speaker and then we will have the discussion. So be fast to get to the food hall, please. Thanks very much. Well, so thanks very much for keeping with the time that I had asked you to keep. We will continue with our plenary session regarding the coexistence between wildlife and livestock. And our next and last speaker regarding this topic today will be Ketil Skorgen. Ketil is a sociologist and senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, NINA. His research has revolved around conflicts over resource management and conservation. Controversy related to wolves has often been in the case in point, often only as an illustrative example of more general social mechanisms. As a sociologist, he has analyzed these phenomena in a context of social and cultural change, power relations, and the urban-rural divide. So please, Ketil, thanks.
Yes. Guess this is intuitive. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a bit of a strange setting for me. I've never attended an animal science conference before. As a sociologist, I've interacted a lot with biologists, but they have mainly been wildlife biologists and people with various kinds of interdisciplinary backgrounds. I've been to many conferences, but never one quite like this one. So it's an honor, of course, to be here and to talk about an issue that is quite relevant, I think, for your main topic, your overarching theme for this conference, which is interaction between, or conflict even, between livestock, domestic animals, and wildlife. Thing is that the boundary between these two categories is far from clear-cut. And it's not only blurry and penetrable, to put it that way, it's also frequently, I would say almost always, contested in more ways than one. And this is not only an intellectually interesting question. I mean, what constitutes a wild animal and what is a domestic animal, and where is exactly what makes up or what constitutes the border between those categories. It is intellectually interesting, and as a sociologist, of course, that is, I mean, the social construction of wildness and domesticness, to put it that way, is, of course, important issues and interesting issues. But this also has quite wide-ranging practical implications, because for management and for strategies, for example, related to dealing with animal disease, whether in wild animals or domestic animals, like several speakers today have talked about already. The definition of a wild and domestic population of animals usually will necessarily have quite large impact on what management or management strategies, mitigation strategies that are available and which are eventually chosen. Also, the term stakeholder has been used by several speakers this morning. Who stakeholders are, who are granted the stakeholder status by government, for example, or by the actors that have the power to define the discourse on an issue, for example, combating animal disease. That's not a clear-cut issue either. I mean, quite a few groups would claim stakeholder status while not being granted such status, and they may represent very different interpretations, as it were, of, for example, the status of wild animals, and have different understandings. So what forms of action are acceptable, permissible, in order to deal with wildlife disease, for example, or depredation problems, for example. So this is an issue that needs to be thought about, at least, and that actually has some very real consequences. I will talk about three examples from Scandinavia, Norway, but also taking Sweden and part of Finland into account. I will soon let you know which ones, but a few words about myself and my research first. I'm a sociologist. I'm affiliated with Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, which some of you may know. It's basically a natural science institution, or historically has been primarily an ecological research institution. I noticed that Nina was involved in one of the networks that were presented earlier today, for example. But increasingly, over the last at least 20 years, we have also quite a few social scientists, including sociologists, have been hired by Nina, and we have a quite strong social science group there now. And the reason for that is, of course, that wildlife management and conflicts over wildlife are basically social conflicts. They're just as much about conflicts over wildlife as they are conflicts with wildlife. As a matter of fact, as a slight detour here now, I'll try to stick to my allotted time, as you may know, there have been conflicts over wildlife, over wolves, for example, in countries that don't have wolves at all. There was this book published, well, it's quite a while ago now, with and I don't remember the name of the author either. He was a social anthropologist, and the book has had this very fascinating title, Waiting for Wolves in Japan, about the Japanese wolf conflicts. Now, there aren't any wolves in Japan, but what they did have was an initiative to reintroduce wolves, same as in Scotland, for example, which unleashed quite intense political conflicts, or social conflicts, you might say, even without the wildlife in question being present at all. So, and my group has done research over, centered around the return of wolves to the Scandinavian peninsula, and Norway in particular, of course. And what we've seen over the 20 years or more now that we've, off and on, of course, been preoccupied with this research, is that these issues are very much entangled in other social and political conflicts. And as mentioned when I was introduced before my talk, I think we've managed to explain how the conflicts over the return of wolves in particular, but similar with many other wildlife populations that increase, particularly in areas where they have been absent for quite long, how these the conflicts are indeed part of much broader and deeper social and political conflicts that occur in many countries. And that has to do with urban-rural relations, for example, power relations, even issues related to social class and cultural differences. Without further ado, my 3 cases in point are wolves, naturally. The question here, which has been some aspects has become quite predominant in the Scandinavian war over wolves, has to do very much with their status as wild and pure or impure hybrids, illegally introduced or naturally recolonizing areas where they have been removed by people. So these topics are, to quite a large degree, at the forefront of the discussion, to put it to use a very mild term, about wolves in Scandinavia. So wild boar, they're returning as well. They've indeed returned to Sweden. They have, I think, 400,000 now, and shoot more than 150,000 each year, or at least last hunting season. And they're now also returning to Norway, of course, like the wolves. Everything comes from Sweden. Wild reindeer. As you probably know, chronic wasting disease has been discovered in Norwegian wild reindeer. First occurrences outside North America. And that has unleashed a very, what should I say, very active campaign to eradicate CWD, which has been hotly contested because it's very draconian measures that have been taken, that are used, and in some cases this also partly relates or is connected to their wildness, as it were. So no conclusions from me, typical sociologist, I guess, but hopefully some food for thought that I think is also practically useful. Now about the wolves in Scandinavia, this is Fennoscandia. this is, no, that was obviously not, where's the pointer thing? On the pointer? In the center? Yeah, sorry, it was quite obvious. Well, yeah, the history of recolonization here is of this southern Scandinavian population here. Is that they migrated from Finland, the Finnish and Russian population, probably in the early 1980s. Whether or not they were totally extinct is a matter of, before that, is a matter of some debate, but they were definitely functionally extinct. I mean, the historical Scandinavian wolf population, like in some of the other parts of Europe. But the thing is that this is quite a long way to walk, and of course radio telemetry has shown for many years ago that that's entirely possible for wolves to cover that distance, and that they regularly do it. But quite a few people saw this as very unlikely, and so that was at least partly the, well, I wouldn't say exactly the reason, because it was not, but something that fueled the notion that these wolves have been illegally reintroduced by the authorities or by a conspiracy consisting of government agencies and conservationists. And many of you know that these stories are told also in other parts of Europe and all over the world, really, when it comes to problematic wildlife. So, and also the question of whether such illegally reintroduced wolves could really be pure wolves arose. So the issue of hybridization became quite central to the fight over the status of this new South Scandinavian wolf population. Interestingly, this is merely an illustration. Don't try to understand it, but I guess some of you can see what it is. This is basically the pedigree of the present South Scandinavian wolf population. Only 3 founders, as I understand the term is, and there have been some additional fresh blood along the way, but not much. So there's a huge inbreeding problem, of course. But the thing is that this has been very thoroughly researched. This is groundbreaking genetical studies, widely published and acclaimed as world leading in many ways, and lots of resources has been used. And there is very few signs of hybridization, none at all actually, in recent years. Or in the current population at all. But despite this, these other interpretations, these other suspicions of the wolves' lack of wildness has actually gained ground to such an extent that even Parliament, due to some quite activistic members of Parliament, managed to convince Norwegian Parliament a few years ago to demand or to decide that the Environment Agency should commission more genetic research in order to clarify the genetic status and degree of hybridization. And this was after this was after this. This is from 2016. After this was despite the fact that all this world-leading research that was already there. I mean, probably at the time when Parliament made this decision, no mammal population in the world was as thoroughly mapped as the Scandinavian wolf population. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted more research in case there were hybrids, and obviously, and also in case it should be able to demonstrate that these wolves did not come from the Russian-Finnish population, but rather from, for example, the Baltic population, which was also part of this, these stories about reintroduction. So, and this, this was carried out. I think 1 million euros were spent. And of course, the conclusions were exactly the same. So now you have even more groundbreaking or very, very good genetic research on Scandinavian wolves. But from a management perspective, it was totally useless because nothing was gained from it. But the thing is that this strong suspicions that they were not truly wild actually made its way to even into Parliament, and they decided that they needed more research. And of course, quite a few people were very disappointed and have already questioned this new research, and that it's probably overlooked important stuff. Another issue concerning the wolves is related to is a problem or an issue that also conservationists and people who are very fond of wolves are concerned with, and that's the extensive use of monitoring. Interestingly, wolf activists on both sides of the divide, so to speak, conservationists and people who want to get rid of wolves, agree that this is kind of an this is a very intrusive and intrusive way to handle wildlife, and it's kind of degrading them as wildlife and actually removing their wild status. What we've seen in our research is that quite a few people, it's very common to see wolves as kind of iconic wilderness species. We know that they're not, in the sense that they're quite adaptive, and often, as I'll show in the next slide here, I can already show it now. They're not that, they quite frequently enter or move, operate near human habitations. But even so, people think of them as the wildest of wild animals, and wild, strong, intelligent, that kind of thing. Even people who don't want to see them in Norway have that opinion about the wolves. And the extensive use of monitoring technology is seen as kind of a degradation of their wildness and kind of a semi-domestication. And this is something that people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, can actually agree on to some extent. So, this shows what this GPS tracking, what the tracking technology can be used for, and this is an area where people claim to be troubled by bold wolves. I think the American expression is wolves that were not scared of moving near habitation, and indeed you can see that that was the case. Whether or not that's natural for wolves or not is another issue, but the thing is that technology is used quite extensively to monitor this quite small population that we have, and that's controversial in itself and kind of infringes upon their status as a wild animal. So, and also the extensive use of camera traps. In Norway, there's very little regulation of the use of camera traps. There's, surprisingly perhaps, because privacy protection is a big issue in Scandinavia, and in Sweden it's very strongly restricted, but in Norway we have lots and lots of private camera traps. This is an official one, or a Nina one. Interestingly, this is a wolf from the pack that we now have very close to Oslo. Interestingly, probably the least controversial pack in Norway. But anyway, this extensive use of camera trapping is also seen by quite a few people as something that infringes upon the freedom, as it were, of wildlife, and raises basically the same privacy protection issues for them as it does for us. And are they wild animals if we have this 100% control over them at any given at all times? So I'll move on to wild boars, and just this is an animal that many of you are familiar with. This is a Norwegian wild boar, so that's what makes it special, as it's this one, and also apropos the camera traps. The thing is that the wild boar in Norway is seen as an unwanted alien species, and that's something that's not. It's not easy. It's not a trivial matter to declare a species as alien and invasive, especially since this is a species that exists all over Europe. Truly wild populations. But the thing is that the Norwegian population has migrated from Sweden, as I already said, and the Swedish population, which has exploded since the 1980s, actually stems from animals that escaped from farming of wild boar, or maybe, it's a little unclear, maybe hunting estates were kept the wild boar for hunting purposes, but in enclosures. So technically they're not wild animals, they have been farmed. And so when they have migrated to Norway, it's possible for Norwegian authorities, after a lot of pressure from the farming organizations, of course, to claim that these are not wild animals. So therefore it's possible to declare them pig non grata, that's the title of a new research project I'm involved in. It's it's going to be quite interesting. I'm going to look at these social constructions, as it were, of the wild boar as wild or non-wild. Interestingly, the Swedish Parliament in 1986, I think, decided that they wanted to treat their wild boar, they're the same population with the same historic origins, as wild. That was not based on any different evaluation of the wild boars from Norwegian or Swedish and Norwegian biologists. It was just that the majority in the Swedish Parliament at the time, following a lot of lobbying from the hunting organizations, for example, just decided that, okay, it's been there for a while, so we treat it as a wild animal. In Norway, the conclusion has been exactly the opposite. Interestingly, it was welcomed in Norway as well by hunters and also many landowners initially, but they have kind of piped down, to put it that way, following a very strong pressure from the farming organizations and political groups that usually side with the farming industry. So now it's not too there's not too much open controversy in Norway, but interestingly, the actual management strategy is very much based on particularly a very technical interpretation of the species status as not wild. So finally, and I'll have to speed up, of course. This is a slightly different example, but anyway, as you know, CWD has been discovered in Norwegian reindeer. Nobody knows how it got here, or whether it's been here all along, but not discovered until now. Anyway, wild reindeer in Norway is, this is dead reindeer with CWD. Doesn't look too good, of course, and it's a horrible disease, obviously. Interestingly, wild reindeer in Norway only exists in Norway. It's only a European population of wild reindeer outside of Greenland. And interestingly, the wild populations are only in the southern part. The lighter yellow parts here, stretching up to the far north, those are domesticated reindeer. There's no wild reindeer in the north, only in the south. And this number 11 here was the population, and these are all subpopulations. We heard about the infrastructure creating problems for various animal populations, and that's very much the case for reindeer. It's a huge threat. So these are now effectively subpopulations, and number 11 here was the one that was affected by CWD. And so Norwegian government quite speedily decided, after some consultations, of course, to confront this head on and actually cull the whole population area, 2,500 reindeer. This is wild reindeer and also a species under a lot of pressure, and where Norway has, of course, a special responsibility for conservation, since it's the only population in Europe. But they still decided. Maybe it was the correct or the best decision, but it was not uncontroversial, to put it that way. And interestingly, the reindeer populations in this particular part are kind of inbred with the domesticated reindeer. They're not that different, but these are not the purest of wild reindeer strains, to put it that way. But what we do have is quite extensive rough grazing of sheep in the same area, and also I'll have to return to this one again briefly. These yellow patches here are also domestic reindeer. And so there was, of course, a lot of concern about spread to the domestic herds. This is not Sami reindeer husbandry. That's up here, also in Sweden and Finland. But it's still productive use of exactly the same species, and genetically not that different, and also leading a life, to put it that way, that's pretty similar. I mean, they're not manipulated that much. I mean, these domestic or semi-domestic stocks or herds, they're moved about a bit and, of course, rounded up for slaughter, but otherwise they live exactly like the wild ones, and you can spot the difference visually. But that, of course, was one of the reasons for these draconian measures that involved killing 2,500 reindeers, partly through license hunting, and also by government or hunters, to put the hunting teams. And there also was this enormous fence was put up to separate this area, because there was I mean, this CWD, these prions obviously apparently can persist in the soil for quite a while, probably for a very, very long time. So there was concern that if this area was recolonized too soon, then nothing would be gained at all. Probably wasn't anyway, because there already CWD has been discovered in other reindeer populations later on, but that's another issue. And also this fence was not that effective. This illustration here was actually made meant to demonstrate that they can deal with. And this is, interestingly, not a reindeer, it's a red deer. And there is also contact between the red deer and reindeer populations in this area. But of course, the erection of such a structure in the wilderness, or what many people see as a wilderness anyway, at the high mountain plateau in southern Norway, was hugely controversial, as was the culling of 2,500 reindeer. And also sheep husbandry. That's a big thing in Norway. The wolf conflicts in Norway are not so much about sheep. I just mentioned it. We can discuss that later if you want to. But conflicts, many other conflicts, including other species of carnivores, is definitely about sheep. And this is a salt lick. I don't know if it's actually in the reindeer area, in the reindeer area that I just, in the Nordfjella area. But you have these kind of salt licks, and interestingly, salt licks meant for cervids, moose, reindeer, and red deer were banned as part of the strategy to combat CWD, but not salt lick for sheep in the same area. That was going too far. I mean, the farming organizations were able to prevent such a measure. But the thing is, of course, that the reindeer and the red deer still seek out these salt licks for sheep. And also, interestingly, I mean, the relation between scarpia in sheep and CWD has never really been, I mean, of course, is probably no mystery that it hasn't been cleared up. I guess that's difficult to do or maybe there are few indications that the connection is too strong. But it was very interesting to observe how Norwegian authorities, under pressure from the farming organizations, decided not to follow that track at all, even though these areas are used extensively for rough grazing of sheep. And that was exactly where the CWD occurrences, we had this CWD incidents with reindeer. So this is another issue where this wild and domestic, not that the issue comes to the forefront, not perhaps so much as a conceptual issue here, even though of course the purity of these wild reindeer strains is something to be discussed or the people can think about. But here we have this direct relation between a kind of power struggle over management strategies that are very much influenced by farming concerns, to put it that way. So just to conclude here, the distinction between wild and non-wild, though socially constructed, blurred, and contests is crucially important for how animals that are not under full human control, so-called wildlife, are actually treated. So I think that's my last word. Interestingly, this is or almost last word. This is the final slide in all NINA, official NINA presentations. I sometimes remove it, but I didn't this time because I think the slogan is, well, okay, it's a slogan. And the thing here is, of course, to demonstrate how we can come in and resolve or at least alleviate conflict over nature-related issues. Interestingly, these are musk oxen, as you can see. We have those in Norway. Well, they're definitely an alien species. Been reintroduced in 2 waves in the last century from Greenland. Extinct in Norway much, much longer than the wild boar. But they are now managed as a wild population because they're good for tourists, I guess, and people, well, like them, and they're, of course, very fascinating animals. But they don't belong in Norway. Thank you. Okay.
So thanks very much, Ketil. Can I ask Francesca, Klemen, and Christian on stage, please, for the panel discussion? I would like to thank very much our 4 speakers because they have presented how collaborative networks are so important to help us solve the issue of coexistence between livestock and wildlife, and how we need to find synergies between different expertises to find the right solutions. I'm sure there will be many questions for the audience. I would please ask you to stand up because I can see you very well. And when you receive the microphone, please present yourselves before posing the question. So if there are any questions from the room.
Hello, I'm Frédéric Leroy in Rai, France. I have a question, maybe rather for Francesca, about the concept of land sharing, land sparing. It seems from what I've seen that land sparing is an efficient way, because when you leave large areas for wildlife, they come back. For large mammal, they come back. But about the land sharing, where wildlife and livestock could cohabitate and coexist, do you have successful example that you can talk about?
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting point, a very nice question. Yeah, exactly. Essentially, the 2 scales are at a stark contrast, because if we do observe this distribution, the moment in which we enter into the process of utilizing the land, then the conflict with humans emerges. Both in terms of utilizing the same resources, but more specifically for the actual presence on the land. So the impression that we have from our behavioral studies is that wildlife species, and in particular large carnivores to which you are referring, know perfectly well how to avoid us and try hard to avoid us, but this is not always possible. Clearly, everyone knows about the fact that some individuals start to target livestock. However, those are usually just a few individuals, as Klemen has underlined, so it's not the population per se to expose this problem, because in general they tend to avoid human landscapes, but it's really the interaction with the human presence that has to be somehow mitigated to avoid conflict. And I think that we need to know more and better what the actual conflict is, what the actual process is, in order to outline specific actions. A big work has been done to reconcile coexistence in general, for example, Pacobace, for what concerns the bears in the Alps, and many other examples. But probably it's the time to become more specific, more, with more chirurgical actions to allow coexistence. And in this sense, as Christian was saying at the end of his talk, it's very important to really interact with the stakeholders locally. So it's very important and very right to have overall policies, but it's also crucial. I mean, eventually coexistence is put in place in very specifically on very specific cases in very local situations, if I answered your question.
Thanks very much, Francesca. More questions here, please.
Yeah, hello, Rafael Mateus Vargas, German Institute for Risk Assessment. And I have a question for you all. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. And you were presenting some really nice approaches to determine risks between in this interface between wildlife and livestock. And you were also talking about some risk management approaches to deal with these problems or challenges. I want you to maybe talk about this step between risk assessment and risk management, which is the risk communication. You were already talking about including different parties like livestock managers and all these people which is involved in some way. And I wanted to ask you, how would be your tip, or how would you do it now that we are also facing a time which people are either repellent to facts? So how do you approach, would you involve these different parties which are having different perspective of maybe the same problem? Thank you.
Maybe I can start with one of the points that I suggested that are so important, which is involving the stakeholders, in this case, the farmers, who are the ones mostly affected by the disease problems and sometimes the wildlife-related problems mediated by disease or not. Involving them from the start in the management. There is one, for me, very spectacular example, although it is from far away. It is in New Zealand. In New Zealand, the Animal Health Board, which is the institution that is in charge of animal health, they are dealing mostly with tuberculosis control. It's their main problem. And the interesting point is that in the Animal Health Board, the voice is the voice of the farmers, and the government is just one more participant in the board. So the decisions are made by the farmers, including that most of the funding of the TB control comes from the farmers and is decided where to use it by the farmers, and therefore New Zealand farmers do not question the activities that are being run in order to control TB. If you look at the European side of things, everything is run by the government. There is some looking for farmer participation, but as a secondary actor. And in Europe, we are witnessing more and more opposition by the farmers against the activities for, in this case, TB control, but you can name any other disease and probably the approach would be similar. So I'm not saying this is always working like this, but I think this is one of several possible solutions.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, I'm all for involving farmers, but there are other interest groups as well. I'm not too fond of the term stakeholder, but anyway, there are others who feel very strongly about these measures, and as we could see from the CWD example, farming organizations did have quite a strong impact on the strategies chosen by the Norwegian government to combat CWD, not in sheep, of course, but in wild reindeer, and also to prevent it to spread to domesticated reindeer. And probably, at least most biologists and veterinarians would say that that influence was not very productive in terms of actually combating CWD. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have any influence, but there are many others as well. And I think, I mean, even among sociologists in the subdiscipline rural sociology, there is this tendency to see the rural as synonymous with farming. But that's not the case anymore. It never was, of course, but most people who live in these areas, I mean, even if you exclude all the urban environmentalists and say that they don't have anything, they shouldn't be involved here, that's a problematic decision as well. But I mean, even if you do exclude them, there are lots of people in these rural areas living close to the wildlife that are not farmers. Most people are not farmers, not even or landowners. So there are. It's a little more complicated, I would say. I'm all for including farmers, but in many cases, farming organizations, for example, are definitely not powerless. They're quite powerful actors, at least in Norway they are. I guess in many other parts of Europe as well. And when you talk of farmers in that way, I totally sympathize, but you always think of smallholders with a few sheep or something like that. But farming is an industry with very strong organizations and very much political clout in Europe, and not least in Norway. And that's not always. It's not obviously productive in conflict mitigation and in disease combat, even, I would say.
I can add another note to go back to your people not being very fond of facts. I think it's very important to always be transparent and as much as possible scientifically grounded in these discussions. And then we know that there is a second stage, which is the reconciliation between different positions. And ethical sides and political decisions that are clearly trying to put everything together, which is not something related to, necessarily related to, it's not consequential, immediately consequential, but at least we should try, at least for those gathering data, to be as much as possible transparent and consistent and grounded in science. I mean, at least that's my view.
Any more questions, please? I have one question also for you all regarding we have seen that there are different perceptions and different legislations in different regions. But of course, wildlife doesn't know about political borders between countries, between regions. Do you think there's some part of this in which it would be easier to reach a consensus regarding a general approach that could be used to facilitate this coexistence?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's there's no easy solution, quite obviously, but I think it's a start to recognize these conflicts as conflicts or disagreements, controversies, or whatever term you choose, as quite deeply embedded in other social conflicts or problematic, or to put it another way, these issues are embedded in cultural, social, economic conflicts, and also people's reactions to processes of social and cultural change, not least in rural areas, in ways that make these issues very strongly political. You don't have to look at climate change to find an environmental political issue that is used very actively. I don't mean use in a negative term, but or at least included in or as I said, embedded in political rhetoric or political perspectives that reach much wider than the issue itself, and that's also the case here, of course, especially when we talk about problems that are most typical or most prominent in rural areas, or obviously all the problems that rural areas face today, and also the social change, demographic change, cultural change within rural communities come into play and influence the way these people think about and discuss and confront each other over these issues. As I said, the wolf controversy in Norway and Sweden is not much about livestock at all, surprisingly perhaps, but that's the case. If it is about anything material at all, it's about hunting. But that's putting it a little strongly. But that just shows that this the struggle over control, as it were, over these over the land in both symbolic sense, but also in a practical sense, is what this is really about, or most this is the deepest aspect of these conflicts, and so realizing that is or acknowledging that doesn't help much, but it's necessarily, but it's a start, and it may actually help us avoid some very very time-consuming and frustrating detours that we don't need to take.
Maybe I just something very quickly. Well, at least maybe we can start from those aspects that are less exposed to cultural differences or specific, I would say, management history, because sometimes management is really, as I'm sure my colleague can confirm, we have like historical way of hunting, historical reserves, and we know these days that maybe some of these traditions are not really supported by the most logical way to manage, but it's a long story of reconciliation. So they may differ a lot between different countries, but at least the infrastructure, it's something that speaks the same token everywhere. And so as Europe, we should really make an effort to be more standardized, more attentive in a homogeneous way in such sense, because you have some areas, some regions or some countries that are particularly dedicated to creating green corridors and allow those spaces that not only support biodiversity but also avoid conflict, and others that are very, putting this at the very, very bottom of the agenda. So, I mean, at least that would be something very, identifiable at the European level, for example. So I think it could be pursued. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Christine.
No, it's fine. No, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think we are in a context of real big change. One part of this context is the conflicts that we are witnessing and that are going to continue through time. And the other part is the transformation of our society from a society largely approving the utilitarian view of animals, both domestic and wild, to a society, at least in the urban part, more approving the ethical approach to our relationship with animals. And that generates conflicts that, as Ketil suggested, are very complex. They are not simple. And at some point, we, the society, will need to make kind of a decision whom we are supporting. I mean, are we favoring somehow the utilitarian money-producing or product-producing part, including farming, or are we going the other way around? And that's a very strong decision, and everybody has his own feeling, position about that. But that's the reality. So we are in front of this change, in front of this emerging conflict, and let's see, hopefully, as Francesca suggests, through science, we are able to deal cleverly with these curves that come ahead.
Thanks. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Anna Olson. I come from the Institute for Research and Innovation in Health here in Porto. I hear science being a keyword here, and it's obviously a very important keyword. This is a scientific conference, but I think most of us, or many of us in this room, are also academics and teachers. And I wanted to ask, how are we actually teaching issues around this tension or conflict to the different future professionals that will deal with this? The animal scientists, the biologists, perhaps the veterinarians. Are we teaching this in a way that animal scientists learn about this exclusively from the farming perspective, and biologists learn about this exclusively from the biodiversity perspective? Or are we perhaps not even teaching this at all? Thank you.
Who wants to take the challenge? Because it's a very interesting question. It
works? Do you hear me? Yes. So I can take this question. So I teach at the forestry, and basically we were taught at the forestry that you have to work with all the different groups of people. And when you asked me this question, and also remember several previous questions, I remember on the story you had about basically our instruction how to handle or how to prepare the management plan for the wildlife and then the wolves. So basically with the wildlife we have a system that Slovenia Forest Service prepare first management draft, and then it's discussed widely between all the interest group, and then you, with huge entropy, you come up with something which should be accepted, but it's never accepted. So it's really painful procedure, but you get something. And with wolf, basically, and brown bear, we said in advance, okay, we wouldn't want that somebody would draft such a plan in advance, so let's get all the groups together, and so they'll prepare something. And so we got all the interest groups, and we had several days of lectures before. And okay, the first management plans that came out were quite accepted by everybody, but on the end, what we're facing for the last years is kind of too strong dominance of NGOs from the city, which actually press down the countryside. And it's really, so it creates a huge social tension. And on the end, basically the faculty, members of the faculty had to interfere and had to buckle down all the wrong information, which was widely accepted with media, and it was launched from NGOs. So yeah, why I remember this on your question. So basically I think you shouldn't take a side in advance, so you should be really open. And if also academia would be close and would just show one part of the story, for example, on biology, just prodigy about how how important this is and forget the human dimension, they would fail, and vice versa. So I think you have to go broad. And I don't think we need to go too fast. So for example, if certain, even country, as a people who generally believe differently, why hurry? We have Norway and Sweden and Slovenia, and for a while we try to actually push one idea over our entire country, but the only thing we learn is that basically we jeopardize everything. So now we would respect the difference and let's time do what it will change the time. And people here are the most important stuff. Okay, you can try to persuade them, try to show them the logic that it works, but you should be really honest with that, because people are not stupid, of course. But if you try to, so if the legislation creates tyranny over people, that's no nature conservation, that's just tyranny. It will not work on long term, that's my perspective.
Well, thanks very much for your answers, thanks for your questions. If you have more questions, you will have your speakers around, so you can chase them at the corridors. With this, I would like to thank you very much for shedding some light over this very complex issue and trying to find the aspects that can help us foster the coexistence between fauna and livestock. So thanks very much to you all. Thank you. And with this, we will move to the last part of our session today. You may remember that yesterday during the welcome ceremony we gave the Leroy Award. This is an award that is the most prestigious one we give away in the Eaap. It recognizes someone with an outstanding scientific career who has been working internationally on issues regarding animal science, who has worked somehow with the Eaap and who shares our goals and our values. The award this year was presented yesterday to Frédéric Leroy. Frédéric graduated as a bioengineer from Ghent University and then obtained a PhD in applied biological sciences at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, where he now holds a professorship in food science and biotechnology. His research deals with bacterial communities in fermented foods, human and animal health, food studies, and food traditions. Frédéric is particularly interested in the role of animal source foods in ethical, sustainable, and healthy diets. He is actively involved in a number of academic non-profit societies, such as the Belgian Association of Meat Science and Technology and the Belgian Nutrition Society. He also serves on the scientific board of the World Farmers Organization and the Danone Institute in Belgium. And today, he will present us the invited talk of his Leroy Award. So thanks very much, Frédéric.
Thank you so much, and thanks again to Eaap for honoring me with this award. I was told beforehand that I could pick any topic of my choice, but I wanted something that matches the plenary session and the theme of this year's meeting. I thought the plenary session, I think the plenary session was a brilliant session. It was really, really interesting. And I would like to build on that by bringing it also back to the diet. So to talk about the dietary implications of many things we've just heard about. I will paint a picture with broad strokes, so forgive me if I'm generalizing quite a bit and quite often here. But I want to, because I think in an award presentation, it's more the purpose of offering a perspective and a conceptual framework than actually a research-based presentation. I will try to bring in a more overarching framework based on the nature-culture divide. Now, what you see on this picture here is a food that most people would see or perceive as natural, because naturalness is part of the symbolic package of meat. but if you scratch away the symbolic surface, you find that things get more complicated. I could have shown you another picture of an industrial slaughterhouse, and a lot of people would have already found that a lot less natural. Or I could enter the discussion from the other side of the spectrum with this tweet that was published by the World Economic Forum, and they are showing a company in Israel, Redefined Meat, that is creating imitation meat with 3D printers. And as you see from the picture, they don't seem to know a lot about muscle biology, but and most people would obviously think this is a synthetic, unnatural approach. But it's good to maybe ask yourself the question why this is happening. Well, it has to do with profit and investments, and it probably has to do with animal rights agendas as well. But part of the rationale is that we're producing foods in factories, so we're freeing up land and giving land back to nature. So in a way, there is a naturalness idea in the entire concept. And that's what you have when you're facing those binaries. Every nature element has a bit of culture or technology, or however you want to call it, inside its design, and the opposite is also valid. The problem is that nowadays we're confronted with the extreme position of the binary. This, for instance, is the half-planet idea, where the idea is that humans should retreat on half of the surface of the Earth and then should leave the other half to nature and not interfere too much with it. Now, if you take that position, you get in all kinds of bizarre concepts and strategies. This is some information that I've combined. The one is coming from Rethinks, which is a think tank, stating that animal agriculture will collapse in the next 8 years. We'll see how that goes. But the interesting part is that besides that, food will be a completely different concept. It will not be the materialized output from agriculture. It will be a flux of information. So you will be able to download or upload your food information and print it on your 3D printer, and that will be the food supply system of the future, according to those people. Now, Bill Gates stated that the rich nations should shift entirely to synthetic beef, and George Monbiot even goes further. He says that we should get rid of all agricultural farming and grow our foods in labs through microbial fermentation, and you create protein pancakes, and that will be the new system, so we can give land back to nature. So those are rather new and you could say radical scenarios, but I would like to emphasize that these ideas are not entirely new to begin with. They're circulating since several decades. This is a fragment or a paragraph from a Rockefeller Commission report that was ordered by Richard Nixon at the time, and it's talking about population growth and the American future. And in the document, they already mentioned the concept of synthetic meats. So they're saying that in the future, the larger populations will imply that we should steer away from animal production and produce those synthetic meats and food from factories, as they call it. That's the same period in time where you have also the Club of Rome, which is again a Rockefeller-connected initiative, and it's a very Malthusian setup. It's all about depleting resources, increasing population, increasing stresses, and using rational design science to have a top-down management of the natural resources. So it's coming from that spirit. And you can go even further in time to 1931. This is coming from the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell, which was one of the leading philosophers at that time, and he talks also about synthetic foods. But interestingly, he's also saying that synthetic foods will be for the masses. The elites will still have natural foods. And natural foods will be the valuable ones. They will be the ones that are more tasty and have more symbolic also importance. So what he's doing here is overlaying this synthetic natural binary on other binaries. Masses, elites, bad, good. And that's the general constellation you have. You have lots of binaries floating around, and they're permutating, and they're overlaying on top of each other. Currently, we have this, and that's something you're probably familiar with. On the left-hand side, you have what we would see as natural foods, and then you have the synthetic versions on the right side. And what's interesting here with those egg-free eggs and meat-free meats is that the synthetic foods are trying their utter best to imitate the natural products. The whole purpose of those foods is to replace the natural version of it with the science-based, technology-based intervention. Now, those are plant-based imitations, so they're basing themselves on extracts and oils and lots of additives, lots of process technology to be able to imitate. There's another approach which is even more interesting, and that's the lab meat. So that's the tissue engineering approach. And this is a picture of the chicken that was lab-grown and presented in Singapore by the company just not so long ago. And you see here that in the title they use the word chicken between quotes. And that's also a fascinating approach, because in the end what we're facing, generally speaking, is a battle over meaning. This is an extract from a lobby campaign by several animal rights groups combined with NGOs and also supported by certain multinationals to put pressure on the European Commission to open up the denominations and the categories of animal source foods to the plant-based imitation foods. So in the end, it's a battle over the word chicken or the word sausage or meat, and taken together, it's a battle over the concept of naturalness. So essentially, this is what Wittgenstein would have called a language game. It's praxis. It's how the community defines the meaning that will ultimately be decisive for the meaning of the concept of the word. And I would like to connect this to an entire body of literature that has been created over the last years, arguing that meat eaters, in particular, essentially wouldn't be wanting to eat meat. They would know it's a bad thing to do, but they rationalize it by using rational arguments to overshadow their concerns. And then this comes back to the concept of naturalness. It's natural to eat meat. It's normal, it's necessary, and it's nice. So it's a theory of the four ends. Now, if you would ask the question to a vegan activist, he would say the exact opposite. Meat is unnatural, and it's abnormal. We shouldn't be doing it. It's unnecessary, and it's even disgusting. So they would just reverse the whole order of hierarchy here. And those four categories, even though they're separated out in four different names, they are essentially interrelated. They are the expression of an underlying belief system. Take normality, for instance. If you go back to what Freud said at the time, normality is when one is able to manage the psychosocial stresses that come with nature and culture. So if you're able to harmonize those concepts, you're in a status of normality. If you're not able to do that, you enter neurosis, according to psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Or necessity, that's an interesting one. If you talk about needs, the model I like to approach here use here is the one designed by Abraham Maslow, which is a quite famous model. It's coming from psychological practices, so because of interactions with his patients, Maslow designed a pyramid of human needs. Now, at the bottom, you have the biological needs. I named it here nutrition, but it's wider than that. Then you have the security need. You need to feel secure. Then you have the need to belong somewhere, the community needs. Then you get to status, and at the top of the pyramid, you get to what he called self-actualization. Now, this model has been criticized, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. One of the criticisms is, for instance, that needs are not always necessarily strictly a need. They may be a want, or what Lacan calls a desire. So a biological need is truly a need. A desire is different. It's unsatiable. You can never really achieve it. It's contagious. If I want something, you'll want it, and vice versa, which makes it a public matter, not a private individual aspect, and brings it into the realm of the symbolic, or in other words, language. But the main criticism is the fact that this pyramid is static. And that's why I would like to connect it in this presentation to work done by Michel Foucault, which is a French historian, or philosopher historian. and use his concept of episteme. Now, an episteme is a worldview. It's a kind of reflection of the zeitgeist where you have the belief system in a way incorporated in a certain constellation. And what Foucault is saying is that history is not a smooth process. It's a jumpy, discontinuous process, and those jumps are triggered by change, by abrupt change in technology, and I'll also talk about change in human-animal interactions that comes in the same package very often. So I'll take it from a structuralist approach to a more post-structuralist, diachronic or historical approach. And here is where I start to generalize quite a bit, and apologies for that, but I have only so many minutes. I would like to enter the first main episteme, and that's the one of the hunter-gatherers. That's 99% of our existence on the planet. And it's been an enormous stretch of time, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years, depending on how you define human. And we don't know so much about it. So I'll have to radically simplify here, and I'll see it as one episteme by taking the common denominator. So for hunter-gatherers, of course, the main basic need here in the system is biology, nutrition. They needed the proper nutrition. And animal source foods were absolutely essential. They shaped our anatomy, they changed our physiology, and there was an absolute need to hunt, even though that was complemented with other activities such as, of course, gathering. But nutrition was absolutely crucial, and animal source food needed to be supplied, at least in a certain amount, depending on the ecological zone. Now, if it's so vital, then you need your next layer here, which is security. And security is the layer that keeps it functional. It's putting the lid on the other one. And to do so, what humans have done, they have developed into the practice of obligate cooperative hunter-gathering. People needed to work together. And then that is guaranteeing your food supply. But it's also unstable, because communities or clans or groups of people can fall apart because of tensions and other problems. So people needed to develop empathy, and which is needed for social cooperation. But by creating empathy, another problem also emerged, and that's the fact that what some anthropologists call the dark event, which means that killing an animal becomes problematic because of the empathy. So there's a solution needed here, and what happened in the next stage is that communities develop their cultural systems, heavily based on rituals. And that's what keeping a community intact. And in those communities, many things play. Humans are extremely complex beings, as you all know, of course, and then there's a very important place there for rituals. Rituals are the codes and the practices that keep things together. And according to Walter Burkert, the kill of an animal is one of the main focal points around which a community structures. And also, it kind of flattens out the tensions in that community by killing the animal. And killing an animal in such an approach is a transactional activity. A hunter goes into a transaction, and he takes something, but he gives something, whether that be a prey or anything else. So it's a very horizontal relationship between humans and animals. So that's been a functional system for a very, very long time. Then something remarkable happens, and that's when we move into a next episteme. And again, I'm oversimplifying here, and there's a brilliant book that has been written recently, The Dawn of Everything, which shows how things are much more complex than I'm showing here. So it's been a very patchy transition, with many exceptions and many other complexities going on. But for the sake of the argument, let's say that we jump into the next episteme of the Neolithic and domestication. Now, in that system, there's a new food supply system, a new food system, based on crops and staples, with a new function for the animals: manure, traction, and many other social functions. In that system, you get formation of elites, accumulation of resources. You get the paradigm of dominion. Humans start to be superior to other humans, and also human-animal interactions go from the horizontal relationship into a vertical relationship, which is still very much based on respect and it's a very rich interaction still, but it's a completely different one. Now this brings in another layer in the pyramid, and that's the one for the need for status. Typically, hunter-gatherers avoid status. Maybe not all of them, and maybe not to 100%. But for instance, if a hunter comes with a big bounty, he will downplay it. He will say it happened by accident. I was lucky, because status can be toxic for a community. So that's when you see that social tensions are starting to build up, and there's this strong desire for status, and that needs a new approach. Animal sacrifice is important in that paradigm, because the animal is sacrificed, the meat is shared, it brings the community together as it did before, but there's also a vertical gradient. The best pieces of the carcass go to the animal, they go to the elites or to the gods, and then the lower pieces are for the rest of the community. So it creates a hierarchy within the system. It also leads to what René Girard has called scapegoating. And that he describes that, he puts it in the Paleolithic times, but I think it's more appropriate in this paradigm where mimetic desire accumulates, leads to tensions, and then those tensions have to be relieved, and then the mechanism of scapegoating comes in. Now, the name says it, scapegoat, it has been based around animal sacrifice. Many things happen. I could talk about the medieval period or the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but let's make another quick jump to the post-domestic societies, the industrialized nations. So this is a typical paradigm for let's say, the urban West as it developed after the industrial or during the Industrial Revolution. And that's again a technological effect. So it's again a big change in the food system, which comes from practical reasons. Railways, refrigeration, they completely change our view on food. And they allow us to, again, eat meat in substantial quantities, especially the middle classes that develop purchase power. Now in the West, we also, since the whole pyramid is more or less filled in, we are in the luxury position that we also can concentrate on the self, on self-actualization. And in that concept, you see that animal-sourced foods, and red meat in particular, is used to communicate and to self-develop and to build identities based on ideas of generosity, masculinity, sensuality, vitality, strength. It's a very symbolic food, and it's used as such. But something else is happening, and that's a value shift in how we look at animals. That's how human-animal interactions are completely changing. And we're moving from the stage of the zoophage to the one of the sarcophage. The zoophage is the eater of animals. The sarcophage eats flesh, eats a commodity, eats a product. And that's a very different thing, because the entire interaction with the animals is outsourced. It's hidden, it's confined to slaughterhouses, and it creates a disruption. And that brings us back to the theory of the four Ns. That's where actually it originates, especially if we go to the next phase, and that's the one we're in now. It's a very unstable phase. But in this phase, we could say that for some people, the sarcophage is developing into the necrophage, the eater of death. And that's the vision or the worldview that, for instance, vegan activists would have. This is a study coming out of Italy where they looked at Italian vegetarians. And by talking to those people, they looked at their perceptions of death. And they essentially found out that a lot of the ideas were about death acting as a contaminant essence in life. And meat was seen as a corpse, for instance. So you have the death-life binary, where always in those binaries, one is the center and the other one is marginalized. So the one is good, the other one is bad. And there's a separation of those instead of an integration. And the thing with the Maslow pyramid is that as long as things go fine, you're in balance. But from the moment the importance of the needs are shifting around, and you end up with a society that is focusing on the top of the pyramid, the self-actualization, the status, forgetting about the foundations at the bottom, because they're taken for granted. You can find your food in supermarkets and so on. Then you're in a very vulnerable position, because if you put a pyramid upside down, it's a metaphor, I know, but if you put the pyramid upside down, it becomes a wobbly thing. And it just needs a crisis to make this thing a very explosive situation. Currently, what we're having is a situation of poor metabolic health, increasing public health issues, fragile food security. We've seen supply chains collapsing a couple of times. Communities are eroding. There's a sense of loneliness or a virtual community. Class anxiety, clearly, because of the income gaps and the way how elites are, or the fact that the elites are drifting away from the middle classes, and a general sense of meaningless existence. Now, that's a very, very toxic situation. And what happens in such a situation, that's what Nietzsche already came up with in the second half of the 19th century. At that time, you had very similar conditions in society. What Nietzsche said was, under such conditions, what happens is that you create a feeling of resentment. And resentment drives a process that he called transvaluation of values. Whatever is strong and whatever is good is turned upside down through the action of resentment. Now, I'm not saying that all people that are vegan necessarily are driven by resentment. Of course not. There are many reasons to be vegan. But I'm talking about more societal undercurrent that we are facing today. Leads me to another concept, or a very related concept, and that's the one of the pharmakon that Derrida again picked up from ancient Greece. And Derrida says a pharmakon, anyway, essentially all things are a pharmakon. They're both good and they're bad at the same time. So a pharmakon, you recognize the word pharmacy. So in a pharmacy you buy medicine, but it's also a bit of a poison. And that can be a balanced interplay. But a closely related word here is the word pharmakos, and that's, in Greek, that means scapegoat. Now, that brings us back to Girard. And the scapegoat typically is the other. It's also monstrous very often, or shown as monstrous. And it's unable to retaliate. Now, animals fill that role to perfection. They are the other. They are presented as monstrous. Think about, cow farts and manure and the way we talk about certain foods, especially in animal rights circles. And they're clearly unable to retaliate. So how to get out of this very toxic situation? Well, I think what has been also identified here by Nietzsche is the possibility or the option and it's coming also, it's been stated before by Spinoza earlier on, is to get away from those essentialist big concepts and start looking at things with small letters. So instead of good and evil, talk about good and bad. Whereby good is the very practical approach to things where you embrace things that are expansive, that are active, that are productive, that multiply your possibilities. And what is bad is what is toxic, what limits you, what is reactive, what is essentially harmful and will just intoxicate either yourself or your environment. And dissolve all those binaries that are no longer in balance and tend to favor one center over the other and then continuously permutate and keep the conflict ongoing. So you could follow the bad scenario where you have all those binaries still at play and then you emphasize again moral eating, using your diet to have a moral expression. You emphasize guilt. You create more polarization. This will lead to further erosion of food traditions. People outsource the problem to companies making their foods, more corporate control, more fragility in the food system, more ultra-processed foods, and nutrient-poor diets. And you just make things worse and worse. Or you could do it the other way around and start embracing the binary by promoting health of soils, health of crops, health of animals, and eventually also health of humans, creating more resilient production systems by integrating animals and plants rather than seeing them as a binary of animals bad, plants good. Promote commensality, change status, anxiety into pride, and just develop a learning path of tradition and innovation. Again, no longer as a conflicting binary. Now, yesterday in the welcome ceremony, we had the Fado intervention, and Fado is, if you listen to the explanation of the singer, is a way to deal with death and life and joy and sadness, and you integrate that into a community activity that is bringing people together and is helping us to cope with those difficult binary situations. So maybe we need a bit more Fado in the food system. And let me end with this last slide, which I think is relevant for this session as well, and I picked it up from a recent publication, where they say that the binary distinction between wild and domesticated, and we're talking about rabbits, may fail to capture the complexities of many human-animal relationships. And that's exactly what it is. But an even more important aspect here, or the big question here, is why do we end up with specific human-animal interactions to begin with? And while flipping through Foucault's Madness and Civilization, there's a part there that talks about animals. And it's interesting that animals, in the medieval period, for instance, they were not seen as part of nature. Animals, or the beasts, were the unnatural part. Naturalness was the divine, the order, the human, and whatever was beastie was unnatural. So that's just how things can change, depending on the episteme. And maybe sometimes as scientists, we're underestimating how much we're conditioned by a prevailing episteme. So I leave it with this. This is from some further publications that go in a bit more detail. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Frédéric, for this comprehensive review about how we have changed our relationships with animals and with animal source foods as we have evolved as human beings and as societies. We will have like 5 minutes questions from the audience, so could you please stand up if you have any question?
Thank you very much for a really enjoyable and excellent talk. I recognized many of the cultural background that I presented in my talk as well. For example, mountains were exactly unnatural, were dangerous, were the house of evil. Just at the beginning of the 19th century, it's only about 200 years that we have this fascination of the relationship with nature reached through mountains. Anyways, my question is related to this divide, this tendency to polarize, and it concerns a scientific term, which is dose, so the quantity. How quantity, and if quantity and how quantity matters in all this discourse. So how much meat, or what is the dose to become toxic, and so if it makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. It's an excellent question. Again, I think we should try to look at things from the pragmatic perspective and trying to get rid of those dangerous binaries. You can see it also with afforestation, for instance. Trees are the symbol of nature by excellence. So some people just have the idea that we have to put trees all over the planet. Just not thinking about the open ecosystems where they wouldn't make a lot of sense. So rather than doing that, rather than seeing the tree as the thing that would emphasize nature, just look contextually, really bottom up at your local conditions and build from there. How much meat should you eat? Well, it depends a lot on the individual. Some people, if they eat too much meat, they get iron overload, and that is dangerous for health. Other people have resilient mechanism to deal with that. And the dietary context will matter. So it's always a very, very contextual discussion. And the danger is if we're outsourcing that complexity to the simplicity of a binary, where we favor one of the two and then see the other one as the scapegoat, then you end up with problems. And it's valid for afforestation, it's valid for, I think, for the wild livestock discussion as well. There's a sweet spot. And the role of science is to look for the sweet spot, but avoiding that you end up disproportionately on one side of the binary. So I cannot give you a very specific answer, but just a plea for more context-driven approaches to whatever you're looking at, essentially.
Any more questions, please?
Good afternoon. Ingrid van Dorpen from Premix. Just two observations, because everyone, I think, is very preoccupied with all this evolution. First of all, the world, our world, is 100% recycling world. For example, everything which is thrown away goes to the earth and is reused in some way. So the animal is toxic, but the manure of the animal is necessary. Because I think there is an English university who is trying to produce cereals or vegetables without any manure, and that is not possible. It turns out that this is not livable. And then the other way, if we make synthetic food, an egg or something composed to be an egg, or a beef, something composed to be a burger, the natural produced from the animal always has more minerals, more vitamins, which are not present in the synthetic one, unless you add it chemically. But then you need so much more chemistry and industry. Is that better for the world? Are questions I ask myself, how we can get out of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yes, it brings me back to the slides I had before, where you could emphasize, the pathway that is the reactionary pathway, where you just try to solve the problems with even more of the thing that created the problem in the first place, and you just build on that track, or you go to the other pathway that is, thinking through more holistically, more bottom-up, more focused on the specific opening of opportunities that will benefit everybody. There's no point in insisting on that synthetic natural binary to begin with, because we need technology in agriculture. Right? I'm all for the livestock agriculture, of course, and I'm very, very skeptical about all the imitation foods that are being proposed for a number of reasons, among which you have cited some elements. But we shouldn't dismiss all technology and become Luddites and just say nature is, because that's also a fiction. Again, you need the best of technology to get the best from your so-called natural approaches. And you shouldn't isolate yourself in a technological design scheme where you try to scapegoat all the other things and throw them out of your system, because you will need your interaction with the environment and your the biological biodiversity resources that we are depending on. So again, there's no clear answer to that question, but I understand your concerns, and they're part of the reason why I made this talk to begin with.
So thanks very much. I think we will have to finish here because it's already 1:45. So I would like to thank very much our speakers this morning for their very, very interesting presentations, very challenging. And I would like to remind you a couple of things. The first one regards this session that has been recorded, and you will be able to access it at the Eaap YouTube website when we have time to upload it. And the second one regards, you may have seen in the program that during Thursday morning mostly, we have the study commissions meetings of the 11 study commissions that we have in Eaap. I would like to remind you all that there's a place for you in those commissions. There are open vacancies every year in different positions in the commissions, and during these meetings on Thursday morning, you will be able to participate. They are open. You can propose topics for next year and help us prepare the scientific program. So I would also like to encourage you very much to be there. So with this, we will end the session this morning. And again, thanks very much to all the speakers. Thank you.